Hey everyone, per your requests, I'm starting Sword of Coming. If possible, you can support me via PayPal, or become a channel member to help me keep this channel running. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chapter 611. Lu Qingfeng stood in front of Lu Qingqing's residence and asked maidservant Zhaoye to bring his younger sister downstairs. Zhaoye felt slightly conflicted. After roughly learning of the truth over the course of the past few days, the young mistress had become utterly heartbroken, especially after hearing that her second brother, Lu Qingshan, had become crippled because of her. In fact, she even thought about committing suicide. If Zhaoye hadn't noticed this in a timely manner and removed all of the scissors and whatnot from Lu Qingqing's room, then it was very likely that the Lion Garden would have quickly gone from celebrating to grieving. Because of this, Zhaoye accompanied her young mistress day and night, never leaving her side. Moreover, Lu Qingqing appeared even more thin and pallid than the time when the slug demon had been terrorizing the Lion Garden. She was so emaciated that she was essentially nothing more than skin and bones. Tell her to come downstairs, Lu Qingfeng instructed in a calm voice. Zhaoye felt terrified, and she immediately ran upstairs to notify her young mistress. Lu Qingqing timidly walked downstairs. In fact, she didn't even dare to let Zhaoye support her by the arm. Lu Qingfeng glanced at his younger sister and didn't say anything. Even though her first brother was clearly inferior to Lu Qingshan in every sense, she had somehow been fearful of him ever since a very young age. The sky isn't going to collapse. Let's take a walk together, Lu Qingfeng said in a slow voice. 1 hour later, Zhaoye anxiously stood outside Lu Qingqing's residence and waited for her young mistress to return. When Lu Qingqing finally returned, Zhaoye saw that there were still tear stains on her face. However, she had seemingly untied the knot in her heart as well. Holding the hems of her dress, Lu Qingqing entered her residence and walked upstairs. An extremely puzzled Zhaoye followed closely behind her. Lu Qingqing suddenly smiled and asked, "Yar, do you want to accompany me to the mountains to cultivate together?" Zhaoye was astonished, and she looked at her young mistress who no longer appeared dispirited and lifeless before nodding in response. Lu Qingfeng continued to walk around the Lion Garden by himself. It was no longer possible for him to become a pure Confucian scholar and elevate his knowledge to a lofty and paramount level. Since he, Lu Qingfeng, had taken that step, he was now doomed to struggle in the muddy pond for the rest of his life. There was no way for Lu Qingfeng to express the pain and grief in his heart. Which scholar didn't want to study in the scripture library and have their essays on morals and etiquette be passed down through the generations? Which scholar didn't want to have a large number of outstanding students all over the world and be regarded as the embodiment of decorum and the leader of the literary world? Which scholar didn't want to have pure wind in their sleeves and clean up Confucianism, potentially forging a new path for it as well? However, some scholars ultimately needed to work as officials, a position in which they would find it most difficult to cultivate themselves and maintain their integrity. Someone needed to deal with the most trifling matters, where they would have to haggle over every single copper coin for the sake of the commoners. Fortunately, it was said that one could balance both scholarly study and official work once one reached a lofty level of knowledge. Lu Qingfeng stopped and turned around when he arrived in front of a small bridge spanning over a stream, and he saw Lu Qingshan and Taoist nun Lu Boqi walking over side by side. In the end, only Lu Qingshan walked over to Lu Qingfeng by himself, smiling and saying, "I want to travel around the eastern treasured Vile continent with Lu Boqi first. I want to visit Lakeview Academy and the Great Sway Nation's Mountain Cliff Academy, and I also want to go on a study tour at the new academy that's just been constructed in the Greatly Empire's Dragon Spring Prefecture." Lu Qingfeng smiled and asked, "Have you thought through everything carefully and made up your mind? If you have, then remember to notify the two teachers and ask for their opinions." Lu Boqi also said that my leg can be healed, but I feel like there's no need to rush, Lu Qingshan replied with a nod. Otherwise, I'll be indebted to her again. If in the future. If we become family, then there'll be less need to worry about these things, Lu Qingfeng said in amusement. Lu Qingshan turned around and was just about to leave. However, Lu Qingfeng suddenly called out to his younger brother and added, "I want to thank you on behalf of the ancestors of the Lu clan and all of the scholars of the Azure Phoenix Nation. The scholarly values of the Lu clan are just as strong as before, And the scholars of the Azure Phoenix Nation are also able to stand up straight and hold their heads up high. Why is this? Lu Qingshan asked in puzzlement. Big brother, what are you trying to say? Why don't I understand? Lu Qingfeng helped his younger brother straighten his clothes as he smiled faintly and replied, There's no need for you to worry about these things, silly boy. You simply need to focus on your studies and strive to become a Confucian sage in the future. That way, you can bring honor to the Lu clan. Big brother, has working as an official caused you to become stupid? Lu Qingshan asked jokingly. You're only a county magistrate right now. So what will happen if you become an assistant minister or head minister in the future? I'll figure it out when the time comes, Lu Qingfeng replied with a faint smile. Also, can I have a chat with Lu Boqi while you go and bid farewell to the two teachers? Lu Qingfeng asked. Rest assured, it will only be a short chat. Of course, that's no problem at all, Lu Qingshan replied with a nod. Lu Qingshan went over to inform Lu Boqi about this, and the latter agreed to Lu Qingfeng's request. While Lu Qingshan walked off to bid farewell to Mr. Fu and Mr. Lu Qingfeng led Lu Boqi to the ancestral hall of the Lu clan. Lu Qingfeng didn't say anything as they walked. Lu Boqi felt slightly uneasy in a very rare turn of events. Of course, this was naturally because of her relationship with Lu Qingshan. It was love at first sight, and this had caused her to feel like a junior when interacting with Lu Qingfeng and Lu Jingting afterward. At the same time, Lu Boqi also had a strange feeling that Lu Qingfeng wasn't as simple and ordinary as he appeared on the surface. Lu Qingfeng stopped outside the ancestral hall and asked, Lu Boqi, let's assume that my younger brother Lu Qingshan will only have the short lifespan of a mortal human. What will you do in this case? I'm already an earth immortal, and it won't be too difficult for me to advance further and become an upper 5-tier cultivator in the future. As such, I'm willing to sacrifice 100 years for Lu Qingshan, Lu Boqi replied. Then what if Lu Qingshan has a bright and prosperous future and aspires to achieve the 3 eternal pursuits of Confucianism? And what if he has the opportunity to truly achieve this? What will you do then? I'll stand by Lu Qingshan no matter the situation. If someone dares to harm my husband's great Tao, then they'll first need to ask my saber, Jing God, and my bonded saber, Jiazhua, whether they agree or not, Lu Boqi replied. Lu Qingfeng shook his head upon hearing this. Lu Boqi frowned and asked, Then what should I do? Lu Qingfeng's voice was soft as he explained. When dealing with significant challenges, especially those that pertain to life and death, I hope that my sister-in-law can consider things from Lu Qingshan's perspective. It shouldn't be the case that your first thought is, Lu Boqi feel should be done, so this is definitely the best solution for Lu Qingshan. I'll go ahead and make this choice for him. To pursue the great Tao is to embark on a perilous journey that's inevitably filled with conflict and death. However, since you've already stated that you'll stand by Lu Qingshan no matter what, then I hope that you'll try to truly understand what it is that Lu Qingshan is thinking and pursuing. That being the case, there's something that I want to make clear to you right now. It's without a doubt that you'll suffer some grievances in the future. In fact, you might suffer some significant grievances. Lu Boqi had initially felt a little awkward after being referred to as sister-in-law, but after hearing Lu Qingfeng's explanation, she now felt nothing but sincere respect and admiration for him. She smiled widely and promised, Rest assured, I'm fully convinced by your words. I accept them with all my heart. I'm a fairly stubborn person, but I can still discern whether a person's words are intended to help or harm. As if a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders, Lu Qingfeng smiled and remarked, It looks like my younger brother has outstanding judgment. He then extended his hand toward the ancestral hall and said, You're an immortal from the mountains, so you only need to bow 3 times to the ancestral hall of the Lu clan. Lu Boqi followed Lu Qingfeng's instructions. However, she noticed that Lu Qingfeng also bowed at the ancestral hall. There was a solemn feeling in Lu Boqi's mind. If everything goes according to plan, then it won't be long before my name is erased from the genealogical records of the Lu clan, Lu Qingfeng said in a soft voice. I'll no longer be Lu Qingshan's older brother at that time. If Lu Qingshan receives a letter from the Lu clan when that time comes, and if he wants to abandon his journey and insists on returning to the Lion Garden to criticize and denounce me, then you definitely have to stop him regardless of whether the two of you are in the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent or the Middle Earth Divine Continent. You must protect him and urge him to continue his journey and his pursuit of knowledge." Even though Lu Boqi was in the dark regarding the context, she still nodded and replied with a wry smile, "You want me to play the villain so soon? You sure aren't holding back." Lu Qingfeng changed the topic and asked, "I heard that you taught Lady Lu Shu a vicious lesson?" Lu Boqi couldn't help but feel guilty and uneasy. However, Lu Qingfeng smiled widely and revealed, "I actually wanted to beat her up ever since I was a little boy, and I initially thought that I would still need to wait for another 7 to 8 years before I could achieve this. So I need to thank you again." Only at this moment did Lu Boqi finally start to sincerely accept the traditions and values of the Lu clan. Somewhere in the distance, Lu Qingshan limped toward the ancestral hall. He saw his older brother chatting merrily with the woman whom he loved, and he was aware that his marriage with Lu Boqi would essentially be a certainty once his older brother gave his approval. A grin spread across Lu Qingshan's face, and the young scholar felt like there were no more difficult matters in the world. Qian Ping'an and his companions entered the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation without a problem. Following their trip to Old Dragon City, this was the second city that flourished with an air of prosperity. In the end, Qian Ping'an still decided to give Julien some gold and silver, allowing him to buy those novels and paintings that Shuro detested with all her heart. Meanwhile, Qian Ping'an also found a time-honored shop where he bought some exquisite xian paper that cost 1 copper coin. Before entering the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation, Qian Ping'an had found a secluded area to move everything from his bamboo bookcase into his minimization treasure. During their stay in the 100-Flower Garden, Cui Dongshan had revealed to Qian Ping'an the secrets behind this grand debate between Buddhism and Taoism. One of the places that he mentioned was the White Cloud Taoist Temple, a temple in the Azure Phoenix Nation that was relatively unknown. Thus, Qian Ping'an had purposely taken a detour and avoided walking past this temple. He had a nagging feeling that he had already used up all of his good fortune in the Lion Garden, so he definitely couldn't be too conspicuous right now and openly swagger into the view of the Cloud Forest Zhang clan and the Imperial Tang clan of the Azure Phoenix Nation. While devouring food in a restaurant on a busy street, he heard the other customers from the city chatting about the grand debate between Buddhism and Taoism that was already nearing its conclusion, but still yet to actually finish. Everyone was filled with spirit and vigor as they excitedly discussed this event. Regardless of whether they supported Buddhism or Taoism, everyone was filled with unconcealable pride as citizens of the Azure Phoenix Nation. In reality, this was also a manifestation of a nation's power and fortune. Qian Ping'an had witnessed this phenomenon in a few other places as well. For example, among the scouts of the Great Li Empire during that blizzard on the border, among the commoners in the capital of the Great Sui Nation, on that young girl in the horse-drawn carriage in Old Dragon City, and in Stalactite Mountain. Qian Ping'an quietly listened to their discussions. Upon seeing Qian Ping'an listen so intently, Pei Qian slowed down her ravenous destruction of the delicious roast chicken and also pricked her ears up to listen. When Julien saw this, he stealthily reached over with his chopsticks and attempted to steal a drumstick and place it inside his own bowl. However, with her sharp eyes and her quick movements, Pei Qian immediately used her chopsticks to block Julien's chopsticks. They stared each other down, and their chopsticks became a blur as they jostled for position and fought for the drumstick. Only when Qian Ping'an looked up to grab some food did the two people call a temporary ceasefire. When Qian Ping'an lowered his head and started to eat again, Pei Qian and Julien immediately started to do battle as well. Qian Ping'an couldn't be bothered dealing with this pair of entertaining treasures. Instead, he was curious about the seemingly coincidental encounter and mystical exchange that the neighboring tables were talking about. As it turned out, the capital had experienced a heavy downpour yesterday, and a scholar visiting the capital city had sought shelter under some eaves. Nearby, a monk had been walking through the rain with an umbrella, and thereupon, an indescribably mystical exchange had taken place. The exchange was short, yet the words spoken were filled with meaning, allowing the customers at the nearby tables to come up with countless mystical explanations. At the time, the scholar had asked the monk whether he could bring him along and let him take shelter under the umbrella as well. However, the monk had replied that he was in the rain, while the scholar was standing under the eaves where there was no rain. Thus, there was no need to assist the scholar. Hearing this, the scholar had stepped forward into the rain. However, the monk had bellowed loudly and told the scholar to look for an umbrella himself, In the end, the scholar had returned under the eaves in utter dejection. Most of the customers were marveling at the profound Buddhist knowledge possessed by the Chan monk, claiming that this was an act of great benevolence and true Buddhism. Even though the scholar had also stepped into the rain, it was because the monk was holding an umbrella that he hadn't been drenched by the downpour. The umbrella in the monk's hand symbolized the Buddhist teachings that could deliver all beings from suffering. So what the scholar truly needed wasn't the Chan monk to assist him, but the Buddhist teachings to provide salvation for himself that were missing from his heart. It was because of this that the Chan monk had bellowed loudly to wake the scholar up. Julien was ultimately unable to snatch the drumstick away from Pei Qian, so he gave up and poured himself a bowl of chicken soup instead. After taking a sip, he pursed his lips and remarked, "The taste is only a so-so." Chan Ping'an smiled and said, "You're still a scholar at heart, so you naturally feel like the taste is very ordinary." Julien nodded and replied, "That's indeed the case. To put in effort and work hard but not receive any rewards. If it were young master or the two brothers from the Lion Garden's Lu clan, you would have readily offered your umbrella to provide that scholar shelter and accompany him home. In fact, the scholar might have even felt a lack of gratitude toward you if he had accidentally stepped into a puddle of water, or had his shoulders become wet because of the rain. If it were a stinky Taoist priest, however, then perhaps none of this would have happened at all. The Taoist priest would have directly walked past without sparing so much as a glance for the scholar standing under the eaves." Chan Ping'an pondered for a moment before smiling and asking, "What if the Chan monk offered to help the scholar after bellowing at him? What if they walked through the heavy downpour together? How would such a bowl of chicken soup taste?" Julien swirled around the chicken soup in his bowl and replied with a smile, "It would perhaps taste much better." Shiro finally understood what they were talking about. Pei Qian was at a complete loss. In any case, she still needed to focus on eating her drumstick. Chan Ping'an smiled at Pei Qian and said, "Don't just focus on eating your drumstick. Eat some rice as well." Pei Qian nodded earnestly, and she leaned back slightly and showed off her bulging belly, replying with a proud smile, "Master, I've already eaten quite a lot." In reality, many other strange things had occurred during the debate between Buddhism and Taoism, in the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation. There were monks who had split apart Buddhist statues with axes and used them as firewood, and there were monks who had wantonly consumed meat and wine in the bustling marketplace, loudly proclaiming that meat and wine were only transitory through their bodies, while Buddha would remain permanently in their hearts. Their voices had been deafening, and passers-by were inevitably inclined to ruminate over their statements. Tears streamed down the face of the young monk as he gazed into the distance and lamented, "For the common people to learn from my actions is for them to enter a demon's den. I was wrong. I was wrong." Near the White Cloud Taoist temple located in the capital, a woman once again unleashed a torrent of abuse at the Taoist temple after her child lost their paper kite to the tall trees. The middle-aged temple master hid far away, and the young Taoist priest sobbed as he walked over to his master, saying in an upset voice, "Master, how about we chop those trees down? We're always abused by the residents living nearby, and even the worshippers have been scared away as a result. Our temple will genuinely receive no incense offerings in the future, and that will lead to us starving as well. Master won't be able to buy any books in the future either." The middle-aged temple master naturally wouldn't chop those ancient trees down, but he had no option but to console his young disciple at this moment, especially with how upset he looked. He held the young Taoist priest's hand and led him to the study. The young Taoist priest sniffed, and he was a little body who had already experienced and overcome many challenges in the White Cloud Taoist temple. Thus, he quickly regained his childish innocence after calming down. In any case, he had already gotten off lightly. After all, some of his senior brothers had even been raked in the face by those aggressive women who were unhappy with the noise pollution caused by their morning bell and evening drum. Because of this, his senior brothers always had to scurry along like unwelcome rats whenever they left the Taoist temple to run some errands. However, everything would be fine once they grew accustomed to this. Indeed, his master had told them that this was part of cultivation. During summer, when everyone was feeling too hot to sleep at night, their master would also feel the same way and be unable to fall asleep. He would also make his way outside and rock a fan back and forth as he sat under the shade of the large trees. One time, the young Taoist priest had asked his master why this was. They were Taoist cultivators after all, so after cultivating for so long, their calm minds should naturally lead to a cool body, should it not? That being the case, why did they still feel so hot? His master couldn't explain this either, so he had simply responded with a smile. Upon seeing this, the young Taoist priest had angrily snatched the fan from his master's hand. Fortunately, the temple master was someone who never got angry at anyone. After consoling his young disciple, the middle-aged temple master retrieved an elementary Confucian text for the little boy to read. He then continued to read the legalist book on his table. Just then he had read the sentence, "Governing a nation is like taking a bath. It's inevitable that one will lose some hair, but this is still something that must be done." After reading this, the middle-aged temple master had raised his calligraphy brush and started to make notes. More precisely, he was starting to make notes again. Indeed, the page was already filled with countless notes, so much so that there wasn't even space for a single needle to stand. Thus, he had no option but to retrieve the cheapest paper to write down his notes. When he finished, he would place this piece of paper between the two pages. The young Taoist priest wasn't especially fond of reading, and he had always preferred to have his master read him stories in the past. He put his book down and walked over to his master, only to see the middle-aged temple master scrawling down notes and having his calligraphy brush become a blur. The young Taoist priest couldn't understand what his master was writing, so he stood on his tippy-toes to glance at the contents of the book. He then turned around to look at his master and asked in curiosity, "Master, what are you writing?" The middle-aged temple master put down the calligraphy brush in his hand, returning it to the brush holder that he had personally carved from wood before smiling and replying, "I comprehended something new after rereading a legalist saying, so I decided to record my comprehension such that I can remind myself the next I read it again. That way, I can know what I was thinking in the past, and I can use it to verify what I'm thinking in the future." After polishing and refining this again and again, the knowledge from the sagely texts can one day transform into my own knowledge. However, the young Taoist priest was still a little unhappy, so he asked, "Master, we're not willing to chop those trees down, but we're always abused and despised by the residents in the surroundings. They complain about this and complain about that, and it feels like everything we do is wrong in their view. When will this end? My senior brothers and I are quite pitiful." There was a kindly expression on the middle-aged temple master's face as he smiled faintly and said in an apologetic voice, "Don't blame our neighbors. If you're feeling angry, then just blame me, your master. After all, your master still doesn't know the answer to your question." The young Taoist priest scratched his head. The Taoist priests in the White Cloud Taoist temple all wore square kerchiefs on their heads instead of hibiscus hats, fishtail hats, or lotus flower hats. There was an expectant look on the young Taoist priest's face as he asked, "Then when will master know the answer to this problem?" Even though the so-called answer that the master and disciple were talking about were completely different things, the middle-aged temple master still sighed and replied in a patient voice, "I still don't know." The young Taoist priest suddenly giggled and patted his master's arm, saying, "There's no hurry, master. We're not in a hurry at all. Do you need me to massage your shoulders?" The middle-aged temple master finished making his notes on that legalist saying, and he pondered for a moment before picking up a Buddhist scripture from the table, one that contained almost 100 Buddhist stories. However, he was in no hurry to open this Buddhist scripture up, and he suddenly smiled and remarked, "Buddha should be much more anxious than we are. However, even Buddha isn't feeling anxious, so why should we feel anxious?" As if recalling something, the young Taoist priest suddenly said, "Oh, that's right. Master, senior brother said that the rice vat is almost empty." The middle-aged temple master nodded and replied slowly, "Got it." The young Taoist priest rolled his eyes. "Master, as always. In the end, does the White Cloud Taoist temple not have to tear down the east wall to mend the west wall as usual?" However, the young Taoist priest suddenly saw something strange. It was as if a shimmering golden breeze entered from the window and flipped open the book on his master's study table. Afterward, it was as if the entire room were turned over and refreshed. The young Taoist priest blinked several times, and he eventually concluded that he had definitely been seeing things. However, his master had closed his eyes, and it was as if he had fallen asleep and was nodding off right now. It was very likely that his master had become tired from reading too much. With this in mind, The young Taoist priest quietly made his way out of the study and gently closed the door behind him. Chen Ping'an looked up and gazed toward someplace. "What's the matter?" Pei Qian asked. "It's nothing," Chen Ping'an replied with a smile. Zhu Lian and Shi Rou exchanged a glance after detecting Chen Ping'an's unusual movement, and the former chuckled. "You go first." Shi Rou forcefully suppressed the discomfort in her heart. It was very likely that this old pervert's gaze would still be as revolting as always even after another 100 years. Her voice was low as she said, "I'm an entity, a being that's innately restrained by the capitals of nations. An entity that stirs up great unease within me, has appeared in the direction that young master is looking. What about you?" Zhu Lian nodded and remarked. Young master looked over after detecting something, and Lady Shi Rou immediately gazed over with an adrift expression as well. "Your appearance was most charming. Even Pei Qian understands the concept of treating others with sincerity. So how does a shameless old man like you not understand this?" Shi Rou fumed. Pei Qian felt slightly aggrieved after hearing this and she quipped, "Big sister Shi Rou, what do you mean even? I'm also very sincere and diligent when I read and write." "Okay." Shi Rou had no option but to look at the little girl with an apologetic expression. Pei Qian waved her hand and started to randomly jumble profound principles from the sagely text together again, saying, "People aren't sages, so who can be without error? Everyone in the world can be forgiven." However, Pei Qian immediately felt a sense of unease after saying this. Sure enough, it wasn't long before she yelped in pain and stood on her tippy toes, with Chen Ping'an dragging her forward by the ear. "You barely understand the sagely principles right now, yet you dare to foolishly show off your so-called knowledge?" Chen Ping'an scolded. Her ear was throbbing with searing pain. After a baptism of fire, Pei Qian was already roughly aware of her master's various levels of anger. If she received a flick or a knuckle to the forehead, then that meant her master wasn't very angry, even if he used slightly more force. If he pulled her by the ear, however, then it meant that he was genuinely angry. If he pulled her ear very hard, then that would be a very bad sign showing that he was very angry with her. However, none of these punishments could compare to Chen Ping'an remaining silent when he was angry, neither scolding nor physically punishing her. Pei Qian was most afraid of this. Chen Ping'an found an inn located in the Chang'an region, one of the busiest regions in the capital. There were many bookshops in this area. However, there was a huge shortage of rooms across all inns in the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation, and there were only 2 unoccupied rooms remaining in the inn. Moreover, the 2 rooms were separate from each other and cost an absolute fortune. This was a clear ripoff, but the young inn attendant stood behind the counter with a haughty expression as if he were telling them to either pay up or piss off. In the end, Chen Ping'an decided to pay up and stay in this inn. Of course, it was necessary to show the inn attendant their passports and travel documents first, as these needed to be recorded and checked by the relevant authorities in the capital afterward. When Chen Ping'an retrieved the necessary documents that Cui Dongshan had prepared for them beforehand, the inn attendant immediately changed his attitude after verifying their accuracy and authenticity. The inn attendant respectfully returned the documents to Chen Ping'an with both hands after making a record, and he was especially polite and even apologized to Chen Ping'an for his earlier disrespect. He informed Chen Ping'an that the inn was genuinely unable to find any extra rooms at the moment, but he would immediately notify young Master Chen once another guest left. Chen Ping'an smiled and agreed to this offer, and it wasn't long before a young lady walked out at the inn attendant's behest and led Chen Ping'an and the others to their rooms. Meanwhile, the inn attendant immediately ran off to look for the innkeeper, informing him that a group of travelers from the capital of the Great Li Empire had traveled south and settled down in their inn. The innkeeper was a morbidly obese man whose eyes could barely be seen. He was dressed in the typical brocade robes of wealthy individuals, and he was currently sipping tea in leisure in a tranquil and refined building. After listening to the inn attendant's report, he saw his employee standing there with a foolish expression as if he wanted to hear an explanation. A sense of anger immediately welled up in the obese innkeeper's mind, and he launched a kick at the inn attendant and scolded. "Why are you still standing there like an idiot? Perhaps you want me to pour you a cup of tea to alleviate your thirst? Hurry up and attend to them." Good heavens! The heavy cavalry of the Great Li Empire has almost charged to the luminous Vermilion Empire, So what if our esteemed guest is genuinely a young master from the clan of an official from the Great Li Empire? Forget about it, I'll go myself, I can't trust you to do anything properly. The young attendant failed to receive any merit for his hard work. And not only that, but he had even been scolded and kicked instead. This caused him to grumble in dissatisfaction in his mind. However, he immediately suffered another heavy smack to the head, following which the obese innkeeper scolded. Even if I think with my backside, I know that you were definitely looking down on our esteemed guests with a haughty expression just then. If it weren't for the fact that you refer to me as brother-in-law, I would have kicked you out onto the streets a long time ago. Indeed, the young attendant had only received this job because of his relationship with the innkeeper. He only dared to curse after returning to the counter, and he grumbled about how his beautiful big sister had somehow become a mistress for this obese pig head. This was truly a very fortunate thing. They no longer needed to worry about food and shelter, and they could also dress in expensive clothes adorned with gold and silver. Every time his big sister returned home to that rundown alley, she would appear much like a royal lady from the palace. It was quite a sight to behold, and this also allowed him, her younger brother, to enjoy shared glory as well. The innkeeper personally came out to greet Chen Ping'an and the others, and he managed to forcibly free up another room for them. Thanks to this, Pei Qian and Shi Rou were able to share a room. Shi Rou didn't need to sleep, and nighttime was also the most suitable time for her to cultivate. Thus, Pei Qian was able to enjoy the bed all by herself. Chen Ping'an was worried that Pei Qian would be afraid of Shi Rou's identity as a Yin entity as well as Du Mao's immortal body, so he first asked her whether she agreed to this arrangement. Pei Qian expressed that she didn't mind, and Shi Rou naturally didn't have any objections either. On the other hand, Shi Rou's hair would stand on end if she were forced to stay together with Zhu Lian, and she would feel as if she were trapped in a predator's den. There were all kinds of small and nuanced matters in the world, and Chen Ping'an had already grown accustomed to paying extra attention to these matters ever since a young age. The more attentive and meticulous he was, the less his companions would need to worry about these seemingly trivial matters. As a result, they could focus more of their time and effort on important matters. This had been the case ever since he had accompanied Li Baoping and the others to the Great Sui Nation's Mountain Cliff Academy. Their two rooms were relatively far apart, so Pei Qian stayed in Chen Ping'an's room to transcribe some texts first. Chen Ping'an was practicing the heaven and earth stance, while Zhu Lian had nothing better to do. Thus, he stood in the corner of the room and maintained an ape-like posture. In reality, both the far-roaming tier martial artist Zhu Lian and the fifth-tier martial artist Chen Ping'an were aware that cultivation was more about their actions during a normal day. For example, the fist stances they practiced while walking, the cultivation techniques they practiced while traversing mountains and crossing rivers, the breathing techniques they used when sitting, and even the fist intent they nurtured when sleeping. As for Pei Qian, she was still too young after all, so she was yet to reach this level of cultivation. Even so, Chen Ping'an and Zhu Lian had to admit that there indeed existed some people in the world who possessed outstanding cultivation talent, even in the field of martial arts, which was renowned for the importance it placed on taking things one step at a time and not taking any shortcuts. Pei Qian was one such talent, and it was almost as if she were cheating as she progressed her cultivation. For example, Pei Qian was able to pick up the 18 stops technique that Chen Ping'an had taught her so quickly that even he had felt utterly ashamed while sitting inside Old Dragon City's dust medicinal shop. After Chen Ping'an finished practicing the heaven and earth stance, he saw the eager expression on Zhu Lian's face and quickly came to an understanding. He asked Pei Qian, who had already finished transcribing texts, to draw a circle on the floor using her hiking pole. He was going to spar inside this circle with Zhu Lian, and whoever left the circle first would lose. During Chen Ping'an's long-awaited encounter with Ma Kuxuan on the streets of the colorful garment nation, they had used this exact method to spar and determine a victor. Their battle had been filled with mystical undercurrents, and if it hadn't been for Ma Kuxuan's Dao Guardian from True Martial Mountain watching over them with cold eyes, it was extremely likely that the two young men from Clay Vase Alley and Apricot Blossom Alley would have fought to the death right there and then. Chen Ping'an would never hold back against Ma Kuxuan, someone whose parents had obtained ownership of a dragon kiln very early on. There were old grievances and new grievances, and there would eventually come a day when Chen Ping'an could comb through all of this and understand the truth. At that time he could settle all of these scores in one fell swoop. Pei Qian felt slightly upset and troubled after drawing the large circle on the floor. Cui Dongshan had taught her an immortal technique before leaving, yet she was unable to learn and emulate it no matter how hard she tried. Chen Ping'an and Zhu Lian stood inside the circle that measured 3 meters in radius and started to unleash powerful punches at each other. Zhu Lian naturally suppressed his cultivation base, similar to what Zheng Dafeng had done when sparring with him and his 3 companions from the picture scrolls. 15 minutes later, Chen Ping'an was thrown back by a punch from Zhu Lian, and his chest was immediately struck by another elbow strike after he landed inside the circle with both feet. Chen Ping'an crashed toward the ground, and he used both hands to slap the ground when he was just 1 foot from hitting it, causing him to rotate in midair and appear much like a spinning top as his large sleeves twirled around. His feet scraped past the inner boundary of the circle as he shuffled to Zhu Lian's side. However, Zhu Lian immediately kicked him in the chest, causing him to shoot toward a wall. Chen Ping'an held his hands behind his back and placed them against the wall, using them to absorb much of the force. Otherwise, the immense force of Zhu Lian's kick would have sent him through more than just a single wall. In the end, Chen Ping'an gracefully landed on the floor and said with a smile, "I lost." Zhu Lian smiled and asked, "Young master, you used quite a lot of strange and interesting techniques just then. Did you steal them from that final battle in the Lotus Flower-blessed land? For example, from Ding Ying, the person who stole my Taoist hat back then?" Chen Ping'an nodded and replied, "Ding Ying was skilled in a huge variety of martial arts techniques, so I ended up learning quite a lot of new techniques from him." After sitting down, Zhu Lian poured Chen Ping'an a cup of tea and said slowly, "Ding Ying is the most talented martial artist that I've ever come across. Moreover, he was very meticulous, and he displayed his demeanor as a fiercely ambitious individual very early on. I knew that I couldn't achieve further success during our battle in the Southern Garden Nation, seeing that I failed to unleash the fist intent that I had accumulated for all my life no matter how hard I tried. Even though I was already severely wounded at that time, Ding Ying still forced himself to wait until the very end before he showed himself. In reality, I could have killed him with ease if I wanted to, and doing so would have been no more difficult than killing a newborn chick. However, I decided to spare him, and I even gave him the Taoist hat that was left behind by an otherworldly immortal. For the next 60 years, not only did the young man not disappoint me, but his wild ambitions actually became even greater than mine." Chen Ping'an smiled and remarked, "No wonder Ding Ying always kept this important battle a secret and never mentioned it to anyone else. As it turns out, he was probably too ashamed to boast, and he didn't want to expose his weaknesses to other people either." Pei Qian huffed and said in anger, "You might not know, but that old geezer seriously caused my master to suffer quite a bit." Zhu Lian smiled widely and asked, "If I had known this earlier, then I should have killed Ding Ying with a single punch back then, right?" Having learned her lesson not long ago, Pei Qian looked at Chen Ping'an before taking a glance at Zhu Lian's punchable expression. It was clear that he had dug a hole for her, and he would even shovel dirt and bury her alive if she took the bait and jumped inside. Thus, Pei Qian immediately shook her head and replied, "No, that's not right." Chen Ping'an showed no signs of rewarding her with a knuckle to the head, so Pei Qian knew that she had answered the question correctly. She packed up the calligraphy brush, ink and paper on the table before carefully placing them inside Chen Ping'an's bamboo bookcase. She then poured a cup of tea for herself and suddenly stood up, whispering to Chen Ping'an, "Master, I don't know why this is, but I suddenly feel like the characters in the books are much prettier now when I read them." Chen Ping'an didn't take this seriously and he asked with a smile, "How so?" Pei Qian made sure to whisper and guard against Zhu Lian eavesdropping on their conversation, and she continued to lower her voice as she replied, "The small blocks of ink used to look extremely dark just like me, but when I look at them now they appear completely different from before. Who do they look like now?" Pei Qian started to count on her fingers as she listed out a few candidates, continuing, "There's Huang Ting who taught me sword and saber techniques, Yao Jinji who has foxy and bewitching brows, Fan Junmao who has a fairly bad temper, and Jin Su who accompanies Aunt Gui. Also, let me clear something up first. It was Old Man Wei who said that big sister Jinji had foxy and bewitching brows and a stunningly beautiful appearance that could bring catastrophe to a nation and her people. I wasn't the one who came up with this description. In fact, I don't even understand what it means to have foxy brows." Zhu Lian roared with laughter and threw the little girl under a bus, exclaiming, "Oh, you can piss off with that excuse. Pei Qian hurriedly ran over, trying to cover Zhu Lian's gossiping and rubbish-producing mouth with her hand. However, Zhu Lian naturally wouldn't allow her to succeed, and he immediately started to weave his head left and right. Meanwhile, Pei Qian bared her teeth and flailed around with her arms. Looking at the old man and the little girl fighting with each other again, Qian Ping'an reminded them, "After purchasing what we want in the capital, we'll visit some famous sites and at most stay here for 2 more days. We'll then head to the Immortal Ferry Station located in the eastern region of the Azure Phoenix Nation, and directly travel to the Great Sui Nation's Mountain Cliff Academy." While continuing to dodge Pei Qian, Zhu Lian nodded and said with a smile, "There's no need to worry about this old servant, young master. However, we should be careful about this unruly little girl who's like a wild horse without a rein. We need to keep an eye on her so she doesn't become the second ox-drawn carriage that charges headfirst into a thicket of reeds. Zhu Lian, you're always jinxing things for me. So be careful that I get serious with you." Pei Qian shouted in anger. Zhu Lian was just about to tease the tan little girl again, but Qian Ping'an unexpectedly said, "Indeed, you shouldn't jinx things for us anymore." Zhu Lian immediately nodded and replied, "Young master is correct." Pei Qian finally found an opportunity to exact revenge on Zhu Lian, so sat down and clutched her stomach, pointing at the old man as she roared with laughter. "And you still have the face to accuse me of having flimsy convictions and swaying loyalty? Old cook, you can piss off with that, hey?" Zhu Lian put on a serious expression and explained, "Your actions are called sitting on a fence without solid convictions, while my actions are called adjusting to the circumstances like a wise individual." "Indeed, a wise and handsome individual." Pei Qian blinked and asked in curiosity, "I heard master say that you were once a peerlessly handsome young master in our home world, the lotus flower-blessed land?" Before Zhu Lian could get started on his lengthy story about his incredible achievements in the past, Pei Qian had already clutched her belly with both hands and banged her head into the table, saying through laughter, "You can piss off with that nonsense, yeah? Ha ha ha, you're going to make me laugh to death. Ow ow ow, my tummy is starting to ache." Seeing that Qian Ping'an was also holding back his laughter, Zhu Lian couldn't help but feel slightly melancholy. The grand debate between Buddhism and Taoism was about to draw to a close, and it was during this time that the emperor of the Azure Phoenix Nation secretly visited a summer palace located near the outskirts of the capital. An esteemed guest was going to visit him here, and even though Tang Li was an emperor in the mortal world, he still didn't dare to slight his guest. This was because the guest was Jiang Mao, a highly respected old man from the Cloud Forest Jiang clan. Not only was he an old immortal at the upper 5 tiers, much like a pillar for the Jiang clan, but he was also a lofty teacher responsible for educating all of the descendants in the Jiang clan. Apart from Jiang Mao, there was also the direct disciple of the Jiang clan who had married into Old Dragon City's Fu clan, and was returning to visit for the first time. Accompanying her was the old maidservant who had followed her to the Fu clan, and it was rumored that she was a nascent tier sword cultivator with devastating destructive power. There were 2 people walking alongside Tang Li, with one being Tang Chong, an old man from the royal family to whom he could temporarily hand power without needing to worry. In terms of seniority, Tang Chong could actually be regarded as Emperor Tang Li's uncle. In the past, he had exchanged many private letters with Assistant Minister Lu Jingting, and they had also engaged in many arguments with each other. In reality, Tang Li had read all of these letters. The other person walking beside Tang Li was an old man with an aquiline nose. He was Zhou Lingji, the #1 cultivator among all of the official immortals in the Azure Phoenix Nation. Many people had already forgotten about the elderly immortal's history as a vagrant cultivator in the past, and they only remembered the fact that he had already served 3 different emperors of the Azure Phoenix Nation. Even though Zhou Lingji's reputation wasn't exactly good, Tang Li was an emperor who had grown up in the royal family, and had his sights set on conquering the surrounding lands and having the Azure Phoenix Nation survive for tens of thousands of years. That being the case, it was only natural that he didn't care about the inconsequential complaints of other people. Regardless of how coldly Emperor Tang Li treated the immortals from the mountains in the Azure Phoenix Nation, he had no option but to respectfully welcome the old immortal from the Cloud Forest Jiang clan as a junior. The 2 parties sat opposite each other. It appeared as if they were purposely sitting so there wouldn't be any notion of host and guest. There definitely wouldn't be any notion of ruler and subjects either. Tang Li instructed an official from the Ministry of Rites to bring Jiang Mao a large stack of documents, as well as some picture scrolls that were prints of stone tablets that had been created using immortal techniques. The external official was a proper-looking young man who was very articulate, and he recounted the process of the grand debate between Buddhism and Taoism to old immortal Jiang Mao as the latter casually flicked through the documents and picture scrolls. The external official from the Ministry of Rites was extremely good at choosing what details to emphasize and what details to skim over, and he would only go into detail when he was recounting a delightful or soul-stirring part of the debate. Even so, he was still crisp and concise, and appeared neither overbearing nor servile in front of a legendary old immortal at the upper 5 tiers. He also responded appropriately when asked questions, and it was without a doubt that he won a lot of face for Emperor Tang Li. This made Emperor Tang Li feel very satisfied, and he turned to his side to look at his uncle, Tang Chong. He's Secretary Song Shangxi of the Ministry of Rites Bureau of Ceremonies, and a descendant of the Green Pine Prefecture's Song clan. He achieved second place in the imperial examination in the second year of Chokue. Tang Chong explained in a quiet voice. You can boost his results during the next evaluation, Tang Li instructed. Tang Chong smiled and nodded in understanding. Why isn't Chief Military Governor Wei present today? Tang Li suddenly asked. Chief Military Governor Wei has a good relationship with someone named Zhang Yun from the Jiang clan, and Zhang Yun is reuniting with his older sister here. So he decided to drag Chief Military Governor Wei along with him, Tang Chong explained. The number 1 official immortal in the Azure Phoenix Nation, Zhou Lingji, was sitting nearby, and his eyelids inevitably quivered when he heard the emperor refer to Wei Liang as Chief Military Governor Wei. In the southeastern region of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, people only knew that there was a Chief Military Governor Wei who inherited the position for generation after generation. There was only a single direct descendant in each generation. Yet the Wei clan somehow managed to keep their legacy intact regardless of how dangerous things appeared. Ever since the ancestors of the Tang clan founded the Azure Phoenix Nation, the nation had already gone through many different emperors. Surprisingly, however, the chief military governor from the Wei clan had been the same person the entire time. Wei Liang was someone who had an extremely close relationship with the Imperial Tang clan and kept his influence and power concealed. And he was also the person from the Azure Phoenix Nation of whom Zhou Lingji felt most apprehensive. Not one of the people but the person. After reading through the documents and listening to the official from the Ministry of Rites, the unpolished jade-tier Jiang Mao smiled and asked, I heard that the Lion Garden's Lu Qingshan performed exceptionally well after being included in the examination at the last minute. Apart from the written documents, are there any picture scrolls that I can observe? Tang Chong shook his head and replied, Senior Jiang, someone warned us that it was best not to enter the Lion Garden without permission. Even guest Elder Zhou could only observe the situation from a mountain peak outside the Lion Garden. However, according to the reports from the spies inside the Lion Garden, and by viewing the situation through guest Elder Zhou's palm in a conservative manner, we were able to confirm that Lu Jingting's second son, Lu Qingshan, did indeed rely on his own abilities to pass the examination. He didn't receive any external help. Jiang Mao smiled faintly and said, Wasn't it just the Great Li Empire's imperial preceptor Cui Chan who gave you the warning? There's no need to treat this as a taboo. Tang Chong smiled and confirmed, Yes, it was none other than Imperial Preceptor Cui. However, Emperor Tang Li felt slightly displeased about this. Because of the great trend of the continent, the Azure Phoenix Nation had no option but to join forces with the Great Li Empire and Cui Chan and participate in their schemes. At the same time, Emperor Tang Li was well aware that he had already fallen to a huge disadvantage against the embroidered tiger. Now, however, Jiang Mao was directly uttering Cui Chan's name in such a calm and composed manner, clearly signifying that the Cloud Forest Jiang clan didn't hold the Great Li Empire and Cui Chan in very high regard. That being the case, what should Emperor Tang Li make of their surface-level politeness toward the Azure Phoenix Nation right now? The Jiang clan looked down on even the Great Li Empire, so how could they possibly respect the Azure Phoenix Nation? Even though Tang Li was displeased, he didn't let his emotions show on his face. To put things bluntly, he would have to smile and accept his fate even if Jiang Mao decided to spit a ball of thick phlegm on his face. In fact, he might even have to act politely and ask the old immortal whether he was thirsty and wanted a drink. Jiang Mao didn't continue to make the situation awkward for Emperor Tang Li, and he retrieved a few picture scrolls that showed two people in two different locations. One location was in the south of the capital, and it was the White Water Temple, which was renowned for its refreshing spring water. The other location was in the center of the capital, and it was the relatively unknown White Cloud Taoist Temple. As for the two people, one was a young monk in white kasaya and the other was a middle-aged Taoist temple master. Jiang Mao nodded and said, "Judging by the current situation, the Buddhist sect has won on the surface, while the Taoist sect has won in the concealed battle. The Lion Gardens Lu Qingshan put forward by the Confucian scholars of your Azure Phoenix Nation also performed quite remarkably, and it's entirely possible that he still stands a chance. However, the Confucian sect can only fight for the second spot at most if it isn't able to do anything else impressive. Is this enough? Regardless of whether it's the Buddhist sect or the Taoist sect, will it be a good outcome for either of them to become the new religion of the Azure Phoenix Nation?" His tone was slightly overbearing. As the oldest member of the powerful clans in the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, the Cloud Forest Zhang clan had once been a large and first-rate clan even in the Middle-earth Divine Continent. The Jiang clan had overseen etiquette before the Confucian sect had even been founded, so it was extremely obvious who the Cloud Forest Zhang clan was supporting in this debate between the three teachings that was being hosted by the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent for the first time. However, if the Azure Phoenix Nation forcibly elevated Confucianism, which wasn't involved in the grand debate between Buddhism and Taoism, to the top rank in the position of national religion simply because of the Cloud Forest Zhang clan's influence, then those with a discerning eye would immediately understand that the Zhang clan had a part to play in all of this. However, would the Zhang clan allow other people to tarnish its flawless reputation? Indeed, this was what made the Cloud Forest Zhang clan so difficult to serve and please. Not only did they want results, but they also wanted the processes used to achieve these results to appear flawless to all of the spectating outsiders. The spectators shouldn't have a single complaint targeted at the Cloud Forest Zhang clan. Now that all of the scholars in the central region of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent were traveling south and gathering at the Azure Phoenix Nation, many of them were incredibly dissatisfied at the fact that Confucian scholars weren't involved in the grand debate between Buddhism and Taoism. These influential clans and individuals from foreign lands made a lot of noise, and there were even a few haughty local clans with very foul tempers threatening to leave the Azure Phoenix Nation if either Buddhism or Taoism replaced Confucianism as the chosen religion of the nation. In reality, those who belonged to the core of the imperial court of the Azure Phoenix Nation were all aware that the Buddhist sect and the Taoist sect were merely fighting for second place. They were fighting to avoid coming last. The Taoist immortals and the eminent Buddhist monks were well aware of this as well. Meanwhile, the Emperor of the Fortune Mountain Nation was only willing to visit the Azure Phoenix Nation with his beloved concubines because he wanted to see just how shameless the Emperor of the Azure Phoenix Nation was going to become. How was Emperor Tang Li going to please both the Cloud Forest Zhang clan and the huge army of scholars who had marched south? And was he going to end up as a laughingstock for half of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent? Was he going to ultimately offend all three teachings in Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism? There was a faint smile on Emperor Tang Li's face as he extended a finger to stroke the tea table in front of him. In reality, the true candidate put forward by the Great Li Empire's imperial preceptor Cui Chan was Lu Qingfeng, Lu Jingting's eldest son, Tang Chong revealed. He's a Confucian disciple with impressive knowledge that leans toward legalism. Oh? What makes him so special compared to other people? I'm very interested in finding out. Zhang Mao narrowed his eyes and said. Tang Chong stood up and retrieved two yellowing books that he had already prepared beforehand. One was a Confucian classic and one was a legalist scripture. Tang Chong was just about to walk over to deliver the books to the old immortal. Zhang Mao didn't move. Yet the two books suddenly flew out from Tang Chong's hands and materialized on the table in front of the old immortal. He casually pushed the Confucian classic to the corner, and it was clear that he didn't want to waste even a second of his time on it. After all, how many people in the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent had the right to discuss the concept of propriety in front of the Cloud Forest Zhang clan? Zhang Mao wasn't being conceited, and it was indeed the case that both he and the Zhang clan possessed immense and indomitable knowledge on this topic. Zhang Mao flipped open the legalist scripture which Lu Qingfeng had studied and annotated. He flicked through the scripture extremely quickly, and there were times when he showed indifference and there were also times when he nodded softly. In the end, his gaze settled on a certain sentence on one of the pages. The annotations beside this sentence had most likely been made on 3 separate occasions, and the original sentence in the scripture read, "To not fawn over those whom you like, to avoid harming those whom you dislike, to adhere to the law in both like and dislike, such is the paramount way to rule a nation." In the space closest to this sentence, Lu Qingfeng's first annotation read, "The character paramount is inappropriate. This character is too lofty, and it should be modified to fundamental instead." After reading the 2 following annotations, Zhang Mao smiled faintly and said, "Not bad. We can use this to test that Taoist priest from the White Cloud Taoist temple." On the surface, old immortal Zhang Mao was the person who possessed the highest cultivation base in the Cloud Forest Zhang clan. At this moment, he casually tore a page from the scripture before returning the 2 books to the table in front of Tang Chong, smiling and saying, "Find an opportunity to let the temple master from the White Cloud Taoist temple coincidentally obtain this book in the near term, and observe how he reacts and what he says." Tang Chong agreed to Zhang Mao's request. Compared to the swirling undercurrents in the building where Zhang Mao was sitting, things were much more harmonious and joyful in a pavilion surrounded by lush green bamboo located elsewhere in the summer palace. Zhang Yun, the tall and sturdy young man who had obtained the fated opportunity in the form of an iron chain from the Jewel Small World, and the person who lived in the small alley in Wasptail Ferry Station, was currently chatting with his older sister who had married into Old Dragon City. Chief Military Governor Wei Liang was sitting beside them and chatting with the old maidservant who appeared quite listless at this moment. Zhang Yun didn't know whether to laugh or to cry as he looked at his older sister's appearance. The young woman raised a brow and asked, "What's wrong? Are you judging a book by its cover? I feel appearance is fairly beautiful." Zhang Yun smiled and replied, "Big sister, speaking from my heart, I have to say that your current appearance is the true antithesis of beauty." The chubby young woman rolled her eyes and said, "Then I can't wait to see what kind of celestial maiden you're going to marry in the future. I'll provide you with some input at that time, lest you be tricked by a bewitching vixen." Zhang Yun put his palms together in a prayer and begged for forgiveness, saying, "Please don't. Big sister. I'm afraid that you'll scare my future wife away with your short temper." The young woman was just about to retort him, yet Zhang Yun had already smartly changed the topic and asked, "Big sister, what kind of person is Fu Nanhua?" Zhang Yun roared with laughter and remarked, "Then I definitely have to find an opportunity to share a drink with this pitiful brother-in-law of mine. We can both share our grievances and complain for several days in a row without pause. In fact, we might even become friends." The young woman didn't have any complaints and she said, "You can do whatever you want." She suddenly recalled something at this moment, and she asked in a quiet voice, "Your master went to look for treasures with his good friend, so did they succeed or not? If they did, then I can secretly travel to Wasptail Ferry Station with you. After all, I've yet to personally see the colored glazed golden body of a deceased Ascension tier cultivator. We do have one at home, but the old ancestor always keeps it hidden, so I still haven't managed to catch a glimpse of it even after all these years." She then continued, "If you help your big sister sneak over and take a look, then I can also give you a special present that I guarantee will make all of the young cultivators in the continent extremely jealous of you." Zhang Yun waved his hands and replied, "Forget about it. My master also has a bad temper, so if I dare to do anything without permission regarding this colored glazed golden body, nothing else will matter, and my master will definitely try to skin me alive. I'm not joking. Back then my master gave me 2 choices. Either go to the Jewel Small World or go to the blessed land owned by the Divine Edict sect to train. I was forced to choose one or the other. After I returned from the Jewel Small World, however, my master started to regret his words, saying that I also needed to go to the blessed land to train. In any case, I had already gone to the Jewel Small World, so why not make it a happy double? My master said that I should take advantage of my good fortune these 2 years, and that after obtaining a treasure in the small world, I might even find myself a beautiful wife in the blessed land." There was a troubled look on Zhang Yun's face as he said in helplessness, "There's no way to reason with such a shameless master." The young woman sneered and said, "You don't realize how lucky you are. In the history of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, how many vagrant cultivators have managed to advance to the upper 5 tiers? How many of them could win the sincere respect of the haughty Li Tuanjing? How many of them could become close friends with the strange old gang leader? You should be content with what you have. If you have time, You should hurry up and return home to offer some incense to our ancestors, thanking them for the good karma that they've accumulated. Zhang Yun shook his head and replied with an apathetic expression, "Don't try to persuade me to return. I genuinely can't bring myself to go back to that place." The young woman sighed and flicked Zhang Yun's forehead with her finger, saying, "You've always been so stubborn ever since you were a child. However, you're already an immortal in the mountains now, so are you still unable to let go of the past?" Zhang Yun didn't reply. He glanced at the old maidservant, and his older sister softly shook her head, signaling that he shouldn't ask about this. As the two of them fell silent, Chief Military Governor Wei Liang and the old maidservant coincidentally started to discuss the Bamboo Sea Small World and Lady Qingshan. Wei Liang looked around at the lush green bamboo surrounding the pavilion and said, "Virtuous people, noble people, and scholars are all fond of green bamboo. However, I want to chop down tens of thousands of stalks of this evil bamboo." It was unclear whether he was serious or joking. "Mr. Wei, it won't be good for you to start chopping bamboo here and ignore our old ancestor who wants to debate knowledge with you, will it?" Zhang Yun's older sister asked in amusement. Wei Liang smiled and replied, "I'll be far too eye-catching if I sit over there, and that will be a violation of my duty as an official." Zhang Yun's older sister was just about to throw another one or two barbs at the chief military governor. However, Wei Liang smiled with squinted eyes and said, "Little Zhang, do you remember when I carried you around when you were still a little baby? Time truly flies, and in the blink of an eye, the tanned baby girl in the cot has already grown up and gotten married." The young woman glared at him and retrieved a piece of raw ginger, something that she had liked to snack on ever since she was young. She then took an angry bite. Wei Liang roared with hearty laughter. Zhang Yun was extremely impressed. Recently, many people started to leave the Lion Garden located near the capital. After the demon was vanquished, many outsiders left, and some people originally from the Lion Garden left as well. Lu Qingya, Lu Jingting's eldest daughter who had been stuck at her childhood home for a long time, was the first to hurriedly leave with her husband. Once bitten, twice shy, and it was indeed the case that her husband had been absolutely terrified by their experience. Afterward, the two teachers Fu Shang and Mr. Lu also left together. Following them, it was Lu Jingting's second son, Lu Qingshan, and Taoist nun Lu Boqi who left. The two of them were preparing to embark on a long journey on horseback, and they planned to travel north and visit Lakeview Academy first. Immediately afterward, Lu Jingting's youngest daughter Lu Qingqing and her maidservant, Zhao Ya, set off for an immortal force in the mountains. Lu Qingqing's older brother, Lu Qingfeng, took leave from the imperial court to personally accompany them into the mountains. The immortal force was located roughly 300 kilometers away, and it wasn't exactly close to the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation. When Lu Jingting was still assistant minister, he had also forged a fairly good relationship with this immortal force. Thus, apart from an abundant amount of presents, he also asked Lu Qingfeng to deliver a letter that kindly asked for the immortal force to accept his daughter even if her aptitude was poor and even if she didn't have talent for cultivation. She could stay as an unofficial disciple and cultivate for a few years. In reality, even though Lu Jingting was no longer the assistant minister of the Ministry of Rites, it wouldn't be difficult for his daughter Lu Qingqing to enter any immortal force in the Azure Phoenix Nation as long as he was still alive. In fact, even the letter would be unnecessary. As the two horse-drawn carriages slowly trundled forward, Lu Qingqing also started to smile more and more. Because of this, maidservant Zhao Ya naturally became much happier as well. Most of the time, Lu Qingfeng would stay in his carriage to read. When they arrived at relay stations along the way, he would come out from his carriage to interact with the locals and manage some relationships. This wasn't as simple as being polite and courteous. After all, regardless of whether these people were minor local officials or petty officials, and no matter how low-ranking their positions were, which of them wasn't astute and tricky to deal with? Lu Qingfeng was the county magistrate and their superior, and these officials could easily discern whether he was treating them with genuine respect or false politeness. Thus, Lu Qingfeng didn't appear like the lofty eldest son of Lu Jingting, the leader of the Azure Phoenix Nation's scholarly world, at all as he interacted with them. Everyone had a good impression of him, and he became a topic of small talk among the various relay stations along the way. Lu Qingqing was still a young woman, so it was only normal that she didn't understand the deeper implications behind her older brother Lu Qingfeng's actions. However, the observant Zhao Ye couldn't help but sigh in admiration, feeling like young Master Lu Qingfeng in the Lion Garden was a completely different person from County Magistrate Lu Qingfeng in the outside world. After arriving at the immortal force located among green peaks, everything went smoothly as Lu Qingqing visited the immortals and became a disciple. After helping his younger sister settle down, Lu Qingfeng didn't leave the mountains straight away. Instead, he was led to the top floor of a tall scenic viewing building near a cliff where he saw an old Confucian scholar in azure robes standing in front of the railings and enjoying the scenery. Standing beside the old Confucian scholar was a handsome-looking young master. Lu Qingfeng sighed in his mind and pushed his complicated thoughts aside, bowing in greeting and saying, Lu Qingfeng pays his respects to Imperial Preceptor Cui. The old Confucian scholar was none other than Cui Chan, the Imperial Preceptor of the Great Li Empire. He had surprisingly come to the Azure Phoenix Nation in person. Cui Chan smiled and made a lifting motion with his hand, gesturing to Lu Qingfeng that there was no need to be so polite. He then pointed at the person standing beside him and introduced, "This is Li Baozhen from Dragon Spring Prefecture. He's the current leader of the Southeastern Division of the Great Li Empire's Green Ripple Pavilion, and the two of you will be frequently working with each other in the future." The handsome young man bowed to Lu Qingfeng and said, "Greetings, Mr. Lu." Lu Qingfeng had no option but to return the gesture. Speaking fluently in the official dialect of the Azure Phoenix Nation, Li Baozhen said, "Mr. Lu, my horizons have been significantly broadened after my southward trip to the Azure Phoenix Nation. There are far too many remarkable individuals, and the Taoist priest from the White Cloud Taoist Temple is just one example. His cultivation base is lowly, yet he actually dares to integrate with Tao and extract profound secrets. Not only that, but he actually succeeded in surmounting that immense gulf that even nascent tier Earth immortals find extremely difficult to cross. However, his actions were far too eye-catching, so it's most likely up to the Cloud Forest Zhang clan whether his actions result in fortune or misfortune." Lu Qingfeng smiled but didn't say anything. Was this an opening gambit? Li Baozhen was truly young and filled with unrestrained vigor. Li Baozhen waited for Lu Qingfeng to respond, yet upon seeing him smile in a mild manner, he also started to smile. Cui Chang glanced at Lu Qingfeng before smiling faintly and saying, "Lu Qingfeng, the two of you won't need to stress about the significant matters in the Azure Phoenix Nation, the Fortune Mountain Nation, and the Lofty Sky Nation in the future. When it comes to minor matters, however, make sure to teach Li Baozhen well." Lu Qingfeng nodded in understanding. There was a relaxed expression on Li Baozhen's face as he smiled faintly and extended a deep bow, saying, "Then I'll be in your care, Mr. Lu." In the River Guardian Temple where Chan Ping'an had composed a work on the wall, a group of generous worshippers had arrived recently, and they were also staying right inside the temple. There were 2 people and a yellow bull. The temple attendant was extremely anxious and afraid as he accepted incense money from them. The young boy in white had a birthmark on his glabella, and he was especially fond of walking through the corridors and observing the stone tables. He was none other than Cui Dongshan, and it was unknown why he had decided to remain in the Azure Phoenix Nation. Night fell, and the round moon was hanging high in the sky when Cui Dongshan asked the temple for a bamboo basket. He walked away to scoop up a basket of water, and it was already very mysterious that not a single drop of water was spilled. However, even more mysterious than this was the reflection of the bright moon on the surface of the collected water. The bright moon swayed with the water, and it remained as bright and adorable as before even when Cui Dongshan walked into the shadows of the corridor. Cui Dongshan sat down after arriving at a certain corridor, and he put the bamboo basket beside him before gazing up at the moon. He was accompanied by only the water in the bamboo basket and the moon on the surface of the water. Cui Dongshan's mind drifted away with his thoughts. Buddha was worried about the suffering of all beings, and the paramount sage was anxious about the Confucian teachings becoming inaccessible and only available to those who were already well off. What about the Tao ancestor? It was said that he was observing that singularity. Perhaps this pertained to Wang Zhu who had been trapped at the bottom of the well, or perhaps it also pertained to that old man in the Yang family's medicine shop. Of course, it was also possible that in the eyes of the Tao ancestor who possessed Tao power loftier than one could imagine, Everyone in the world could exist as that singularity. Cui Dongshan rubbed his cheeks and retrieved 2 ordinary jujube with scrolls from the minimization treasure inside his sleeve. He then unfurled the scrolls and had them hover in front of him. On one of the picture scrolls, there was an old scholar dressed in worn-out clothes. The old scholar was sitting in the middle of a bench, and a 20-year-old Cui Chan was sitting by his side. On the other side were the young Zui Yu and Qi Jingchun. There were 4 people sitting on the bench, making it look relatively squished. Someone's head had barged into the picture scroll that should have belonged to the old scholar and his 3 disciples, and this person's head was cocked to the side with a beaming smile. Not only that, but he had even raised 2 fingers. Elsewhere in the picture scroll, there was a large figure squatting in the corner with his back facing everyone else. On the other picture scroll was the person whose head had barged into the first picture scroll. He was standing in the center with his arms spread apart, and the young Zui Yu and Qi Jingchun were each grabbing one of the man's arms and hanging in the air with their knees bent. There were wide grins on both of the young boys' faces. The young Cui Chan was standing behind the man with a relatively more reserved smile, but it was clear that he was also smiling in sincere happiness. Cui Dongshan thought to himself, when could he, Chan Ping'an, and that tan little girl also leave a picture scroll? For the next 2 days, Chan Ping'an brought Pei Qian and Zhu Lian with him as he wandered around and visited the shops in the capital. Meanwhile, Shi Rou stayed back in the inn to look after their rooms and belongings. The streets were indeed bustling, and because of the grand debate between Buddhism and Taoism, the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation was filled with all kinds of people from the 3 teachings and 100 schools of thought. Some sought fame while others sought material benefit. Of course, there were also people like Chan Ping'an who were purely here to enjoy the scenery and also purchase some local specialties of the Azure Phoenix Nation. Perhaps due to their familiarity with Chan Ping'an, neither Pei Qian nor Zhu Lian found it strange that Chan Ping'an liked to visit and wander around bookshops. However, the extremely perceptive Shi Rou noticed some clues. When wandering around the bookshops of various sizes, Chan Ping'an almost never touched those new books with high-quality prints. He showed little interest in the classics of the 100 schools of thought as well. Rather, Chan Ping'an would almost always flick through the unofficial history records of minor officials, as well as the local county chronicles of various nations and other similar types of miscellaneous books. In addition to these, he would also read over the clan genealogy books that were often tucked away in the corners. However, Chan Ping'an never purchased these books after flicking through them. This had caused many bookshop owners to roll their eyes at him. Fortunately, they were accompanied by Zhu Lian, who liked to spend carelessly whenever he had money. Thanks to his help, they weren't scolded by the shopkeepers and kicked out of the bookshops. As for Pei Qian, she was most likely considering the fact that Chan Ping'an had bought the most renowned and expensive Shen paper in the Azure Phoenix Nation for himself, following which he had bought a pair of imperial green glazed go stone containers for Zhu Lian and a small gourd for her. He had spent an exorbitant amount of money, far more than what he would usually spend. Thus, even if Pei Qian saw some items that she genuinely liked, she would only steal a few glances at them and not ask her master to purchase them for her. In any case, the treasure box that Yao Jinji had given her was truly full to the brim already, and it would be impossible for her to put anything else inside. Perhaps she should ask her master for a brand new treasure box? Pei Qian mulled over this for a moment, but she eventually decided against doing so. Even though her master had earned some grain rain coins in the Lion Garden, he had already purchased several items for her and the others. That being the case, she would ask about a new treasure box the next time her master earned some money. At the end of the day, this was simply because they were poor. While wandering around the streets and shops these past few days, they had heard some small pieces of news that were just barely relevant to them. According to Zhu Lian, the emperor of the Fortune Mountain Nation had extremely unique tastes that he couldn't help but admire. The powerful ruler of the Fortune Mountain Nation didn't like slender and shapely women, and he was instead fond of chubbier women only. There were 4 concubines whom he liked the most, and these women could no longer be described as simply plump. Each of them weighed more than 100 kilograms, and the emperor of the Fortune Mountain Nation adoringly referred to them as charming pig, charming dog, charming bear, and charming sparrow. Among the 4 concubines, charming pig Yuan Yi was even more renowned for something else. She was one of the 4 martial arts superior grandmasters in the dozen or so nations located in the southeastern region of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. Emperor Zhongkue of the Fortune Mountain Nation was currently accompanied by his 4 charming concubines and staying at a relay station in the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation. 2 days ago, Emperor Zhongkue had dressed in casual clothes and visited the Buddhist temples and Taoist temples in the capital with Charming Sparrow, the most slender of his 4 favorite concubines. Unexpectedly, a conflict had arisen between them and a group of young masters when they were offering incense in a temple. Charming Sparrow had attacked without mercy, directly beating the young masters half dead. This conflict had caused a huge commotion, and the officials responsible for maintaining law and order in the capital had arrived to address the issue. Not only that, but high-ranking officials from the Ministry of Rights attended to the situation as well. This was inevitable, as the conflict pertained to the diplomatic relationship between the 2 nations. After finally appeasing all parties with much difficulty, it was determined that the troublemakers were a few young masters from large clans in the capital, as well as several wealthy friends who had traveled here from the north. After learning of Emperor Zhongkue's true identity, the young masters and the wealthy friends relented and didn't cause any further trouble. However, just as this conflict was resolved, another issue immediately arose. Several people who had just settled down in a new residence in the Azure Phoenix Nation were suddenly killed in a horrifying manner. It was said that even the coroner had wanted to throw up when examining the corpses. It wasn't long before a rumor spread throughout the entire capital, with people saying with certainty that the brutal methods used by the culprit were none other than the methods commonly employed by Charming Pig, the martial arts superior grandmaster from the Fortune Mountain Nation. The victims were dismembered, and only their heads were left on their torsos. Not only that, but the culprit had even struck several of the victims' acupoints, making them go mute and even helping them stem their bleeding. As a result, the victims had died a slow and painful death. The Imperial Court of the Azure Phoenix Nation rapidly put together a team to investigate the matter. At the same time, they immediately sent a group of experienced officials from the Ministry of Justice, immortal guest elders from the Imperial Court, and renowned cultivators from the Cultivation world to the relay station where Emperor Zhongkue was staying. However, this was still not enough to suppress the public outrage, and countless officials and scholars gathered together to encircle the relay station where Emperor Zhongkue was staying. If it weren't for the law enforcement officials of the capital holding everyone back, and the 200 elite infantry personally deployed by Chief Military Governor Wei Liang watching over the crowds with intense gazes and preventing the situation from deteriorating any further, it was very likely that things would have descended into utter chaos and ultimately led to unimaginable consequences. After all, the powerless scholars could only face the fate of being brutally slaughtered by one of Emperor Zhongkue's 4 beloved concubines. Charming Pig Yuan Yi announced that she would challenge the Great Marsh Gang's Zhu Fengxian, another member of the 4 martial arts superior grandmasters in the southeastern region of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. If she lost, then the Fortune Mountain Nation would accept the accusations being made against them. If she won, however, then all of the scholars from the Azure Phoenix Nation who were blindly causing trouble outside the relay station would have to kowtow and apologize. There were rumors that old demon Zhu Fengxian had traveled around on a sanguine horse-drawn carriage in the past, and he was also renowned for having wreaked havoc and caused significant bloodshed in the cultivation world of several nations during his prime. He was indeed in the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation right now, and he was staying in one of the numerous Taoist temples. Yesterday, the notorious Zhu Fengxian finally returned to the cultivation world, surprisingly accepting Charming Pig's challenge and walking into the relay station as the #1 hero of the Azure Phoenix Nation. He was going to engage in a life-and-death battle with Charming Pig Yuan Yi. From the moment that Zhu Fengxian left the Taoist temple in a horse-drawn carriage to the moment that he arrived at the relay station, countless commoners and cultivators from the Azure Phoenix Nation and the corresponding cultivation world lined the streets and waved and shouted in support. However, the adversarial forces were always one step ahead, and Zhu Fengxian, who carried the hopes of countless people in the Azure Phoenix Nation, was surprisingly no match for Charming Pig Yuan Yi. He was defeated by Charming Pig, who was ranked second out of the 4 martial arts superior grandmasters, and he was severely wounded and casually lifted up by the neck. Charming Pig Yuan Yi was drenched in blood but relatively uninjured, and she swaggered out of the relay station with Zhu Fengxian still in her hand. She then swept her gaze across the speechless crowd before tossing the limp and unconscious Zhu Fengxian onto the street. Before re-entering the relay station, she reminded the crowd to come here and kowtow tomorrow. Zhu Fengxian was picked up and placed inside the horse-drawn carriage by a group of teary-eyed disciples from the Great Marsh Gang, and he was immediately rushed back to the Taoist temple to receive treatment for his grave wounds. There was silence outside the relay station, and there was incessant wailing outside the Taoist temple. After coincidentally hearing about this incident in a bookshop, Qian Ping'an continued to wander around and look for books. Pei Qian didn't feel much pity for Zhu Fengxian, and she simply felt like he had suffered a very miserable fate. Moreover, he wasn't very powerful, yet he still insisted on stepping forward to make a name for himself. Was he not aware that he could hide inside the Taoist temple? Because of his poor decisions, he had now been beaten to the verge of death by that obese charming pig. Not only that, but his reputation was also in tatters. According to the descriptions of the cultivation world in that novel Pei Qian had read, martial artists who lived and fought in the cultivation world would be as good as dead if they lost their fame and reputation. There was only one thing that made Pei Qian feel a slight sense of sympathy. When climbing the mountain and traveling to the Golden Osmanthus temple back then, they had temporarily stayed in the luxurious residence that Zhu Fengxian had constructed on the mountain for his granddaughter. Zhu Fengxian was a wealthy and generous person, and Pei Qian quite liked this about him. However, it was a shame that even if old geezer Zhu was resilient enough to survive this time, it was incredibly unlikely that she would be able to freeload off him again in the future. They had met by chance back then, and they had first sheltered from the downpour together before climbing the mountain together. In the end, Zhu Fengxian's granddaughter, Zhu Ziang, and Lu Qingcheng from the lofty Sky Nation's Blusher Hall, had both become direct disciples of the Golden Osmanthus Temple's old immortal Zhanggua. Pei Qian and Qian Ping'an had watched the disciple recruiting ceremony that had been filled with a whole sequence of elaborate formalities and stretched for almost an entire hour. Pei Qian had ended up with a headache, and she had been forced to stand there like an inanimate wooden puppet from the beginning to the end. Indeed, she had found this even more tiring than transcribing texts. It was noon when Qian Ping'an walked out from the bookshop, and he stood on the steps outside and became lost in thought. "Young master, what are your thoughts?" Julian asked in a quiet voice. Shiro felt extremely anxious, and she quietly prayed that Qian Ping'an wouldn't choose to get involved in this messy situation. Qian Ping'an's answer left her partly satisfied and partly anxious. "We'll head over to the Taoist temple to visit Zhu Fengxian," Qian Ping'an replied. "If his injuries are serious, then I coincidentally have some alchemical pills that I can give him. We can take our leave after greeting him and giving him some alchemical pills. Young master is a loyal friend, and more importantly, young master can still act with calm and prudence in such a situation," Julien praised. Pei Qian glared at him and accused. "Why are you stealing my words, old cook? What am I meant to do now?" Julien didn't hold back, replying in a blunt voice. "What are you meant to do now? You can go and eat shit. You don't need to spend any money, and if you're still not full, you can give me a yell and wait for me outside the toilet after we return to the inn. I guarantee that it will still be warm." "How disgusting," Pei Qian rolled her eyes and said. Qian Ping'an paid no heed to the argument between the old man and the little girl, especially since this was a daily occurrence. After asking some passers-by for directions, they walked together to a Taoist temple in the capital that had suddenly shot to fame overnight. It took them roughly 1 hour to arrive near the Taoist temple, and there was a sparse crowd of people standing outside the temple walls. Some people left after hurling some abuse and tossing a few rocks inside, while most people were here to join in on the fun. These people would leave in satisfaction after walking a lap around the outside perimeter of the Taoist temple. Apart from them, there were also some people from the cultivation world who had hastily made their way here after hearing of the news. These were cultivators whose fathers and ancestors had most likely suffered at the hands of the Great Marsh Gang in the past, but these cultivators didn't dare to wantonly unleash a torrent of abuse at Zhu Fengxian or the disciples of the gang. They naturally weren't stupid enough to provoke the wounded gang either. After all, it was still unknown whether Zhu Fengxian was dead or alive, and there were also several notorious disciples of the gang standing guard inside the Taoist temple. Just a single one of these disciples would be powerful enough to defeat the ordinary martial arts elites of the Azure Phoenix Nation. The Taoist temple wasn't large, and it was closed and not accepting any visitors today. Chen Ping'an stood at a side entrance and knocked for a long time before a Taoist priest finally opened the door for him with a guarded expression. Chen Ping'an explained that he was an old acquaintance of gang leader Zhu, and he asked the Taoist priest to please deliver a message to the Great Marsh gang for him, telling them that Chen Ping'an was here to visit. The young Taoist priest nodded in understanding, telling Chen Ping'an to wait for a short moment. After closing the door behind him, it took 7 or 8 minutes before he returned with a disciple who had accompanied Zhu Fengxian and Zhu Xiang to the Golden Osmanthus Temple. The disciple of Zhu Fengxian breathed a sigh of relief after seeing Chen Ping'an, and he led Chen Ping'an and his companions to the depths of the Taoist priest. He didn't speak much as he walked, and he simply spoke with politeness and thanked Chen Ping'an for remembering this friendship. There was the thick smell of medicine wafting through the air as they arrived near a building, and a few of Zhu Fengxian's disciples were respectfully and solemnly standing in the corridor outside. Their expressions were serious, and they simply nodded in acknowledgement when they saw Chen Ping'an, not relaxing in the least. After all, they had only had a brief chance encounter when traveling to the Golden Osmanthus Temple, and human nature was a most unpredictable thing. Heavens knew whether this outsider with the surname Chen was visiting with good intentions or ill will. If it weren't for Zhu Fengxian, who was still lying in his sickbed, personally instructing his disciples to let Chen Ping'an and his companions into the Taoist temple, no one would have dared to open the door for them and allow them inside. Chen Ping'an told Zhu Lian, Shi Rou, and Pei Qian to stay in the corridor, not allowing them to approach Zhu Fengxian's room. After one of Zhu Fengxian's direct disciples opened the door for him, Chen Ping'an walked inside by himself with his sword and bamboo bookcase still on his back. Zhu Fengxian was sitting on his bed with his back resting against a pillow and a blanket over his body, and his face was deathly pale as he smiled faintly and said, After bidding farewell on the mountain, we've now reunited again in a foreign land. However, I'm actually in such a pitiful state right now. Apologies for this embarrassing display, young Master Chen. His injuries were severe. Apart from Zhu Fengxian, who was sitting on his sickbed, there was also an old and expressionless Taoist priest standing in the room. After Zhu Fengxian's direct disciple stepped inside and closed the door, the old Taoist priest carried a chair over for Chen Ping'an before returning to his spot. He didn't leave the room, lest Chen Ping'an suddenly draw his weapon and attempt to kill Zhu Fengxian. Chen Ping'an put his bamboo bookcase beside his feet before sitting down and asking in a soft voice, Gang leader Zhu, you didn't conceal your identity when entering the capital? Zhu Fengxian coughed for a moment and strained himself to smile, replying, Of course I tried to conceal my identity. However, the imperial court has a strong intelligence network and I wasn't able to hide myself properly. This Taoist temple in the capital is a division of the Great Marsh Gang that we've been working hard to grow and maintain for the past 30 years. However, it's entirely possible that the imperial court has its eyes on this Taoist temple already. Even so, this shouldn't really matter. The emperor of the Azure Phoenix nation always yearned for the cultivation world when he was young, so after he ascended the throne, it can be said that he's treated the cultivation world fairly well. As long as the conflicts and revenge killings between forces in the cultivation world don't go overboard, the imperial court of the Azure Phoenix nation will seldom get involved. In reality, Emperor Tangli was still the crown prince back when I marched through several nations and defeated everyone in my path. I've heard that he admired me greatly, and he announced that he would definitely summon me to the palace one day since I was a martial artist who had won face and reputation for the Azure Phoenix nation. Thus, even though I was mysteriously singled out by Charming Pig this time, I couldn't bring myself to quietly sneak away and leave the capital even though I was well aware that someone was trying to bring me harm. Zhu Fengxian was struggling to speak, with his voice choppy and quiet as he explained the situation to Chen Ping'an. Upon seeing this, Chen Ping'an decided not to ask the old gang leader any more questions. He bent down and opened his bamboo bookcase. As Chen Ping'an did this, both the old Taoist priest and the direct disciple tensed up and prepared to strike. Chen Ping'an stopped his movements and explained, I have a few bottles of alchemical pills from the mountains. Of course, these alchemical pills aren't miracle medicines that can rapidly heal one's wounds and repair one's acupoints, but they are indeed quite good at replenishing one's qi and nurturing one's soul. They're not bad at repairing the bodies of martial artists either. Zhu Fengxian wanted to raise an arm, yet he was so weak that he couldn't even do this. In the end, he placed his hand on his blanket and gently shook it at his two loyal subordinates, saying, "There's no need to be anxious. My judgment of character is better than my skills in martial arts. Right now, anyone in the capital might potentially sneak over to target me, but only young master is an exception." While walking over to the Taoist temple, Qian Pingyan had purposely walked through a small and secluded alley so that he could retrieve 3 bottles of alchemical pills from his pocket treasure and move them into his bamboo bookcase. Otherwise, it would be far too eye-catching if he directly summoned them from thin air. After taking out the 3 bottles of alchemical pills, Qian Pingyan handed them to the old Taoist priest and said, "Spiritual master, please examine these alchemical pills first and determine whether they're suitable for treating gang leader Zhu's wounds." Zhu Fengxian couldn't help but chuckle. "Young Master Qian, you're giving away life-saving medicines out of goodwill, yet I've never seen anyone appear as wronged as this when doing so. You're probably the first in the world." The old Taoist priest accepted the 3 bottles without expression before walking to the table and pouring out a single alchemical pill from each bottle. He then retrieved a silver needle from his sleeve and carefully broke the alchemical pills into pieces. Qian Pingyan didn't become angry about his good intentions being treated as ill will, and he instead felt like the old Taoist priest's actions were befitting of a true cultivator from the cultivation world. Even though Zhu Fengxian was feeble and deathly pale, his mood was quite good at the moment, and this was largely thanks to his powerful foundation as a 7th-tier martial artist. The disciple standing in the room signaled with his eyes that it was time to see the guest out, but Zhu Fengxian ignored his signal and asked with a smile, "Young Master Qian, do you think that charming pig is the true culprit?" Qian Pingyan shook his head and replied, "I've never met her and I don't understand her character and personality either, so I can't say for sure. Logically speaking, the imperial consort of the Fortune Mountain nation shouldn't be so foolish as to use a unique ability to brutally murder several people at once in the capital of another nation. It's also unlikely that this is being used as a diversion, although it is indeed possible. In the end, this might still become an arm wrestle between the 2 nations in the southeastern region of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. In other words, it's not necessarily important whether Yuan Yi was the true culprit or not. Thus, it wasn't worth it for gang leader Zhu to accept her challenge. On the other hand, the mastermind who set you up is quite a clever person, so you need to be extra careful when you leave the capital in the future." Zhu Fengxian nodded and replied, "That's indeed the case." Upon hearing this, the old Taoist priest who was fully focused on examining the alchemical pills couldn't help but look up and glance at the young man. Qian Pingyan stood up and took his leave after chatting with Zhu Fengxian for a brief while longer. Zhu Fengxian was unable to leave his bed and stand up, so he could only cup his fists in farewell with much struggle. However, this movement tugged at his wounds and caused him to enter a fit of coughing. Qian Pingyan and the others left the Taoist temple and returned to the inn. After returning to Zhu Fengxian's room, the disciple who had led Qian Pingyan and the others out of the Taoist temple wanted to say something yet couldn't help but hesitate. Zhu Fengxian smiled and asked, "What's the matter? You're thinking about having Qian Pingyan accompany us out of the capital. If he's willing to help us, then that will naturally be the best-case scenario," the man replied honestly. "Since he was willing to come here and visit gang leader Zhu, it shows that he's on friendly terms with the Great Marsh gang. If we persuade him a little, perhaps." Zhu Fengxian sneered and cut off his disciple's fanciful dreams, interjecting with a cold chuckle, "How foolish. A person who is never content is like a snake trying to swallow an elephant. Are you pretending that you didn't hear Qian Pingyan's reminder for us to be careful when we leave the capital? What was he implying when he said that? He's already made his intentions very clear. Bringing me medicines was a gesture of goodwill to honor the relationship that we formed during that chance encounter in the mountains. After visiting and giving me the medicines, it can be said that he's already done more than enough to honor this relationship. Do you understand this? Don't try to take advantage of other people's kindness and treat their goodwill as a sign of stupidity." How could the man not understand this? However, he still lowered his head and said, "But the situation right now is far too dangerous." Zhu Fengxian sighed and said, "Thank goodness you stopped yourself and didn't try to gild the lily. Otherwise, if it's Xiang who faces trouble while cultivating in the Golden Summit Taoist Temple in the future, do you think Qian Pingyan will help her even if he's coincidentally nearby?" The man remained silent. He understood all of this, but it was extremely likely that the Great Marsh Gang and his master, Zhu Fengxian, would be unable to overcome this perilous situation. From the Taoist temple to the main gates of the capital, and from there to the home base of the Great Marsh Gang, it was entirely possible that one section of the journey would be transformed into a journey to their demise. That was indeed the case 30 to 40 years ago in the Azure Phoenix Nation, the man replied with a chuckle. Zhu Fengxian closed his eyes. The old Taoist priest looked over and announced, "There's nothing wrong with these alchemical pills. They're extremely high grade, and it's without a doubt that they cost a small fortune. They can help gang leader Zhu recover from his wounds, and it's not the case that they'll only suppress the symptoms. Rather, they can genuinely address the root cause and heal the wounds." "For real?" the man asked in delight. The old Taoist priest shot a sideways glance at him and asked, "You don't believe me?" "I wouldn't dare to doubt you," the man replied with a smile. The old Taoist priest was none other than the old military advisor who had meticulously and tirelessly come up with strategies and advice for the Great Marsh Gang for the past several decades. Moreover, it was thanks to his keen judgment and insights that Zhu Xiang was able to embark on the path of cultivation at such a young age. Zhu Fengxian suddenly opened his eyes and asked his disciple to leave the room first. After his disciple closed the door, he said slowly, "Go on, tell me what you're after. Why did you suddenly plot against me after helping me for so many years? I won't resent you no matter what the outcome is. However, I simply hope that you and the mastermind behind everything can look after Xiang in the future. It would be best if you allow her to cultivate in peace in the mountains and avoid dragging her into this mess." The old Taoist priest stood up and walked over to sit on the chair where Chan Ping'an had sat just then, sidestepping the question and saying, "Old Zhu, I feel like Chan Ping'an is extremely mature for his young age." He then sighed with emotion and continued, "Older members of the cultivation world like us are becoming more and more unpopular. The youths nowadays like to throw out the rules and traditions and beat their masters to death for the sake of rising up the ranks. They don't adhere to these things anymore." Zhu Fengxian looked at the old Taoist priest and asked with a smile, "Just how old are you? You had this same appearance when I first met you, and after almost 60 years, you're still walking around with almost the exact same appearance." The old Taoist priest thought for a moment before replying, "As of now, I've spent half my time traveling around my home nation and half my time traveling around the Azure Phoenix Nation." Seeing that his old friend was unwilling to give a straight answer, Zhu Fengxian didn't try to dig any further. Doing so would be pointless. A conflict had arisen in a temple between Emperor Zhongkue and a few young masters from large clans in the capital, as well as several wealthy friends who had traveled here from the north, and his concubine, Charming Pig, had taught them a harsh lesson and left them half dead. That night, several people had been brutally dismembered and killed. The residents in the capital were gripped with fear, and they also felt a shared sense of hatred for the envoy from the Fortune Mountain Nation. The wealthy clans that had migrated south to the Azure Phoenix Nation were also furious, and this had resulted in an unavoidable conflict between the Azure Phoenix Nation and the Fortune Mountain Nation. Charming Pig Yuan Yi had explicitly challenged Zhu Fengxian, a fellow member of the 4 martial arts superior grandmasters, and their battle had ended with Zhu Fengxian suffering severe wounds. Afterward, not a single spectator returned to the relay station to kowtow to her. Because of this, Charming Pig Yuan Yi publicly mocked the character of scholars in the Azure Phoenix Nation, once again causing a huge uproar in the capital. In fact, the conflict between the Azure Phoenix Nation and the Fortune Mountain Nation became an even hotter topic than the grand debate between Buddhism and Taoism. At the same time, the wealthy clans that had migrated south to the Azure Phoenix Nation contacted the local clans to work together and put pressure on Emperor Tangli of the Azure Phoenix Nation. After all, Emperor Zhongkue of the Fortune Mountain Nation was about to swagger out of the capital with his 4 concubines, and this was something that caused the entire cultivation world of the Azure Phoenix Nation to boil with rage. In just a few days, winds of trouble and tumult quickly swept through the entire nation. Everything was linked together and immaculately planned. When Chan Ping'an and his companions left the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation, a horse-drawn carriage trundled along the small road outside the Lion Garden during the night. The carriage driver was no ordinary person, and he was actually the strongest of the 4 martial arts superior grandmasters in the southeastern region of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. He was an extremely tall old man, and he was currently disguised and had just snuck into the Azure Phoenix Nation from the lofty Sky Nation. He was a far-roaming tier superior grandmaster, and his martial arts cultivation base was far above that of the Fortune Mountain Nation's charming pig Yuan Yi and the great marsh gang's Zhu Fengxian, both of whom were at the 7th tier. After reading an intelligence report from the Green Ripple Pavilion, Lu Qingfeng said, "It's time to stop now." A handsome young master sitting opposite him smiled faintly and asked, "Time to stop already? I initially wanted to use my official authority for private affairs so that I could meet a certain someone. It seems like they haven't taken the bait yet." "It's time to stop," Lu Qingfeng repeated with a calm expression. The person sitting opposite Lu Qingfeng in the carriage was none other than Dragon Spring Prefecture's Li Baozhen. After exchanging a glance with Lu Qingfeng, he smiled and replied, "All right, since Mr. Lu says that it's time to stop, I'll heed Imperial Preceptor Chui's words and learn more from Mr. Lu. In any case, this is only a small appetizer for the Azure Phoenix Nation's Emperor Tang Li following my appointment to this position. With this, he won't be of the misunderstanding that he can sit back and rest easy simply because he can rely on the powerful Cloud Forest Zhang clan. After all, some bouts of sinister wind and rain can also cause one to suffer serious wounds." Lu Qingfeng offered no response to this. After drawing near the Lion Garden, Li Baozhen suddenly smiled and said, "I won't enter the Lion Garden. I'll stay in the carriage and wait for Mr. Lu to finish discussing the proper matters with the old assistant minister. We can then return to the county office together." Lu Qingfeng exited the carriage and walked under the night sky into the Lion Garden by himself. Li Baozhen also exited the carriage, but he didn't step down onto the ground and instead sat behind the carriage driver. He was also someone who had walked out from the Jewel's small world like Changping'an, and there was nothing better for him to do at this moment, so he swung his legs back and forth and said with a smile, "I get angry whenever I think of the fact that my precious little sister likes to refer to Changping'an as junior uncle. However, what can I do? As little Baoping's older brother, I can't bring myself to scold her at all. That being the case, I have no option but to entertain that little bumpkin from Clay Vase Alley. If it weren't for his help in accompanying little Baoping to the Great Sui Nation, then Yuan Yi and Zhu Fengxian wouldn't have simply fought against each other. However, what I admire most about the Imperial Preceptor is still his ability to predict others' thoughts and actions. In reality, everyone is planting spies in each other's backyards, and many places in the capital of the Great Li Empire were also riddled with a large number of spies back then, from the Palace of Eternal Spring to even the subordinates beside Song Chongjing. Even our emperor wasn't free from this. After all, wasn't there a powerful person from the 100 schools of thought assisting our emperor with ulterior motives? Now that we've reached the endgame, we're able to take another look at the situation in various places around the Go board. It appears like we've suffered some minor losses here but made some huge gains there. In the end, the overall situation is more beneficial to our Imperial Preceptor. This is very frightening. After rambling to himself for a long time, Li Baozhen smiled at the carriage driver and asked, "Even in my current position, I'm still temporarily unable to access your files. Can you explain why you're willing to work for the Great Li Empire? Hopefully you don't stumble and fall in your political career, or else I'll be the first person to rush over and kill you," the old carriage driver replied in an indifferent voice. Li Baozhen paid no heed to this and he remarked, "You should really change your terrible habit of speaking your mind to everyone. At the very least, you should only say something if you eventually find an opportunity to kill me one day." "All right, I'll repeat myself again at that time," the carriage driver replied with a cold chuckle. There was a brief moment of silence. Lu Qingfeng was still yet to return. "Is the cultivation world fun?" Li Baozhen asked. "It's not fun and people die very easily there," the carriage driver replied in a solemn voice. "Oh, is that so? Then I'll restrain myself a little," Li Baozhen said. "I've only just arrived here, so I'll familiarize myself with the local traditions and customs first. I've never been a courageous person, especially since there were so many powerful beings in my hometown. In fact, even farting on the streets would make me feel afraid of accidentally disturbing a nearby terrestrial immortal or martial arts superior grandmaster or whatnot." Li Baozhen lightly slapped his knees with both hands as he continued. "It's commonly said that a reunion between fellow townsmen will cause tears to well up in their eyes. I wonder who will cry the next time I encounter that little bumpkin with the surname Chan. That stupid little girl, Zhu Lu, cried uncontrollably when she found me in the capital back then. My heart almost broke for her, so much so that I almost killed her with a single slap. I gave her such a simple task, so how in the world did she screw up? Because of this, I was scolded by Her Majesty and lost my opportunity to rise up the ranks of the imperial court of the Great Li Empire. Otherwise, would I need to travel to a crappy place to slowly work my way up the ranks? The old carriage driver chuckled and said, "Sinister people like you will suffer an extremely cruel fate when you fall from your position and experience trouble one day." Li Baozhen sighed and lamented. "See, you're speaking your mind again. Why do you always refuse to listen? This is a bad habit." It was already late at night. Li Baozhen looked at the lion garden and chuckled. "Mr. Lu over there is far more pitiful than me. I'm at most only filled with evil schemes, and the number of people who fear me will only increase by the day. Meanwhile, he's filled with unspeakable pains, and the number of people who curse him will only grow more and more." Inside a small relay station in the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation, the atmosphere was extremely heavy and solemn. The relay station was small, but it was filled with crouching tigers and hidden dragons tonight. Two people were glaring at each other. The young boy in white pointed at the old man in azure, jumping up in anger and scolding. "Old bastard, didn't we agree to follow the rules and refrain from using powers beyond the go board in this gamble of ours? Yet, you actually tossed Li Baozhen into the Azure Phoenix Nation at this critical moment? With his personality, is it remotely possible that he won't use his official position to avenge private grudges? Have you no shame, you old bastard?" The old man in azure remained expressionless as he replied in a calm and indifferent voice. "Little boy, are you not equally as shameless? Who was it that secretly delivered a message to Chan Ping'an and asked him to block the path leading to the lion garden?" The handsome young boy with a birthmark on his glabella continued to let loose a torrent of abuse at the old man, yelling, "Old geezer, you were the one who broke the fucking rules first. You were essentially trying to ruin the foundation of my great Tao by cooking up a plot to frame Chan Ping'an. Yet, you won't allow me to fight back and give you a whack too." The two people in the room were none other than Cui Dongshan and embroidered tiger Cui Chan. In other words, it was essentially one person talking to himself. Cui Chan remained calm and indifferent the entire time, and he wiped the spittle from his face and asked, "Is it very fun to curse yourself?" Cui Dongshan chuckled in anger and exclaimed, "It feels amazing." Cui Chan smiled coldly and said, "Looking at your pitiful and pathetic display right now, I finally understand why my cultivation base was capped at the peak stage of the 12th tier back then." Cui Dongshan plunked down on a chair and replied, "If I had known earlier that you would become such a good-for-nothing, then I would have chosen to choke myself to death back then." Cui Chan smiled faintly and remarked, "It's not too late to kill yourself now. However, remember to leave me your immortal body and your pocket treasure." Cui Dongshan rolled his eyes and rested his head and arms on the table with his hands spread apart. His cheek was also resting on the table as he asked in a sullen voice, "The emperor is dead? Is Song Chongjing going to act as the protector and temporary ruler soon?" Cui Chan nodded in reply. Cui Dongshan didn't raise his head as he asked, "Then who's going to become the new emperor? Or are the two original heirs going to split the power between them?" Cui Chan ignored Cui Dongshan, pretending not to have heard him. Cui Dongshan lifted his head, and he went from lying on the table to slumping back in his chair. "How boring. I feel like you're quite happy about being that person's disciple," Cui Chan said. Cui Dongshan continued to roll his eyes at the old man. Seeking joy amidst sorrow and hardship? Cui Chan couldn't help but feel slightly puzzled. If he remembered correctly, he never had such a personality when he was younger. Cui Dongshan finally stopped rolling his eyes, hesitating for a moment before asking, "How is the old geezer doing in the bamboo building in Downtrodden Mountain?" Cui Chan remained silent for a long time before replying. Lu Chan comprehensively severed his path of advancing to the 11th tier. However, he's in a fairly good headspace nowadays. Cui Dongshan crossed his legs on the chair and asked, "What will you do if Chan Ping'an beats Li Baozhen to death?" Cui Chan shook his head and replied, "Chan Ping'an once promised Li Shixing that he would spare Li Baozhen one time. After that, however, each side will take responsibility for their own life and death." Cui Dongshan suddenly looked up and dazedly stared at Cui Chan. That's right. I already calculated everything and put in the necessary controls. Cui Chan explained calmly. Li Baozhen is still too young and inexperienced right now, so he still needs to suffer some hardships if he wants to become majorly useful in the future. Cui Dongshan roared with laughter and jumped down from the chair, walking over to massage Cui Chan's shoulders as he grinned sheepishly and said, Haha, as expected of the other me. I accused you wrongly, old Cui, so please don't get angry at me. Please calm down. Cui Chan was unfazed and he replied, If I had known earlier that you would appear in the future, then I should have indeed choked myself to death back then. Cui Dongshan lightly smacked the back of Cui Chan's head and scolded. What inauspicious drivel are you spewing? Tui tui tui. Regardless of how our paths of the great Tao different, we should both strive to become bad people who never die. If you continue to spit on my head, then you don't need to dream about becoming a bad person who never dies, Cui Chan warned. On the small path winding past the thicket of reeds and connecting the lion garden to the official road, a horse-drawn carriage slowly ground to a halt. The old carriage driver tensed as if he were facing a powerful enemy, and Li Baozhen was also struck by complete disbelief when he pulled back the carriage curtains and saw the person standing in front of them. Was this really happening? Was he truly encountering a fellow townsman in a foreign land? Li Baozhen's mind whirred as he looked at the young man who definitely shouldn't have appeared on this road. Was it Lu Qingfeng, the person sitting behind him, who was trying to harm him? Did he yearn to dominate the Azure Phoenix nation behind the scenes by himself? However, it didn't make sense for the Imperial Preceptor to allow Lu Qingfeng to grow unchecked. Rather, it made much more sense to have him and Lu Qingfeng keep each other in check. In that case, perhaps this was just a curious coincidence? Perhaps this was an unexpected chance encounter? Li Baozhen heaved a soft sigh. If his luck were indeed this terrible, then it would be much better if this were a plot designed by someone to harm him. After all, one could rely on their brains to battle on the go board. If his fortune was truly bad, however, then perhaps he needed to offer incense and pray to Buddha? Li Baozhen stood behind the carriage driver and asked in a quiet voice, How is it? The old carriage driver's voice was solemn as he replied, Of the subordinate standing behind him, it's extremely likely that the hunchbacked old man is a far-roaming tier martial artist. His cultivation base is most likely no lower than mine. Li Baozhen slapped his forehead and lamented. The intelligence reports have screwed me over. According to the latest intelligence reports, 3 of Chun Pingan's 4 Grandmaster-level subordinates had left his side during their stay in the capital's 100-flower garden. Only 2 subordinates had remained with him, one by the name of Zhu Lian. The intelligence report had marked his strength as unknown, saying that it was possible that he was a Vajrabadi tier martial artist. The other subordinate acted strangely, and his performance had also been very ordinary during the conflict in the Lion Garden. Thus it was very likely that he was weaker than Zhu Lian. As for Chun Pingan, he was at least a 5th-tier pure martial artist judging by the punches that he had thrown atop the walls of the Lion Garden. He was also able to draw talismans, and he was wearing an immortal Tao robe that they found difficult to determine the grade of. The gourd hanging by his waist was a sword-nurturing gourd named Jiang Hu, and it was temporarily unknown whether he was using it to nurture any flying swords. However, this wasn't important. As long as Chun Pingan remained in the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation, Li Baozhen had determined that it wouldn't affect him at all even if Chun Pingan suddenly transformed into a terrestrial immortal overnight. Li Baozhen was borrowing the unstoppable trend of the Great Li Empire to aid him on the go board and toy with Chun Pingan, who was a mere piece stuck on the go board. Following the subtle movements of the different pieces, the spies from the Great Li Empire's Green Ripple Pavilion were like a continually shifting spiderweb that stretched over the southeastern region of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. Before Li Baozhen left the Great Li Empire, Imperial Preceptor Cui Chan had given him 3 choices. The first was to travel to the Great Sui Nation and keep an eye on the Imperial Gao clan as well as the Yellow Court Nation and the other historical vassal states of the Great Sui Nation. The second option was to travel to the luminous Vermilion Empire, the biggest obstacle standing in the way of the Great Li Empire's southward expedition. There were countless sword cultivators in this empire, and the actions of Lakeview Academy to the south were also of utmost importance. The final option was to travel to the Azure Phoenix Nation. Compared to the first 2 options, however, It was very clear that the Azure Phoenix nation was nothing more than a secluded little town compared to the Great Sway nation and the luminous Vermilion Empire. Yet, following the southward migration of wealthy clans from the central region of the eastern treasured Vile continent, the Green Ripple Pavilion had started to increase its investment in this area during the past 2 years. Of course, this was merely the surface appearance of things that Li Baozhen saw after becoming an official. Otherwise, he wouldn't have failed to obtain files about the old carriage driver sitting in front of him. Li Baozhen wasn't stupid. There was the Azure Phoenix nation's Tang Chong in the imperial court, and there was the great marsh gang's Zhu Fengxian in the cultivation world. Not long ago, Imperial Preceptor Cui Chan had personally traveled here, and even made a rare exception to meet up with the Lion Garden's Lu Qingfeng. What did all of this prove? It proved that Li Baozhen had sound judgment by choosing the Azure Phoenix nation as his origin of a dynasty in the imperial court of the Great Li Empire. At the very least, he was temporarily free from the whirlpool of chaos that was engulfing the imperial Song clan of the Great Li Empire. A whirlpool that could easily pulverize people into smithereens. In other words, he had definitely gambled correctly by taking the third option. Li Baozhen felt slightly angry at this moment. If they waited for a few more days, then a powerful figure responsible for keeping him safe would enter the Azure Phoenix nation. At that time, he would no longer need to be afraid of anything. Chief Military Governor Wei Liang? The Imperial Tang clan's chief guest Elder Zhou Lingji? These people would barely be worth a mention. Yet, how had the little bumpkin managed to pick such a perfect time and location? Li Baozhen turned around and bent down, pulling back the curtains and asking with a faint smile, "Mr. Lu, do you have any backup plans?" Lu Qingfeng shook his head and replied with a smile, "Just like you, I need to wait for a few days before a martial secretary from the Great Li Empire will arrive here to act as my personal bodyguard. Mr. Lu, can you bear to watch your ally die before he's achieved final success?" Li Baozhen asked with a pained expression. Lu Qingfeng pondered for a moment before replying, "We need to trust Imperial Preceptor Cui Chan's flawless planning and foresight." Li Baozhen sighed and put the curtains down. By the looks of it, interaction with the little bumpkin was inevitable tonight. It wasn't the case that Li Baozhen didn't trust the go skills of embroidered tiger Cui Chan, rather. He was afraid that the Imperial Preceptor didn't necessarily regard him, someone with wavering loyalty, as an important piece. In fact, Li Baozhen firmly believed that if Cui Chan were forced to make a choice between him and Lu Qingfeng, he would choose to sacrifice him and keep Lu Qingfeng without a shred of hesitation. Cui Chan would casually pick him up and toss him back into the ghost stone container. At the very least, this would be the situation right now. Indeed, how had the mountain of shattered porcelain in his hometown been created? Was it not created by the pitiful people who had been viewed as unimportant? People who had been abandoned and sacrificed, and eventually pulverized in the battles for the Great Tao? Li Baozhen had enjoyed climbing to the top of the mountain of porcelain by himself since a very long time ago. He felt like it was quite amazing to stand atop the pile of white bones. Chen Ping'an told Shi Ro to stand back and look after Pei Qian. Meanwhile, he continued to walk forward with Zhu Lian. Cui Dongshan had suddenly sent a secret letter to him, saying that Li Baozhen would appear at the Lion Garden. The content of the letter was simple and concise, and Cui Dongshan had concluded with the words, "You can kill him." Chen Ping'an hadn't hesitated or doubted the veracity of the letter at all, and he had immediately left the capital and made a beeline for the Lion Garden. Regarding some matters that didn't pertain to the foundation of the Great Tao, Chen Ping'an would choose to trust Cui Dongshan. For example, he had listened to Cui Dongshan's suggestion and allowed Shi Ro to possess Du Mao's immortal body. And now, he had chosen to trust Cui Dongshan again. Chen Ping'an slowed down when he was around 50 paces away from the carriage. He could clearly see the young master who was standing behind the carriage driver already. It was this person who had taken advantage of Zhu Lu's admiration and adoration of him, also baiting the father and daughter with a chance to break free from their lowly status and have Zhu Lu become a noble lady in the future. Because of his manipulation, Zhu Lu had smiled and walked up to Chen Ping'an in that corridor back then, with her hands clasped behind her back and her heart brimming with killing intent. Compared to Chen Ping'an's life and death battle with Sun-Scorched Mountain's mountain-moving ape in the small town, his final interaction with Zhu Lu had allowed him to further understand the subtleties and sinister nature of the human heart for the first time after leaving the Jewel's small world. Chen Ping'an, This appears to be our first encounter, right? Li Baozhen stood behind the carriage driver and waved with a faint smile, continuing, "Oh, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Li Baozhen, Li Shixing's younger brother and Li Baoping's older brother." Qian Ping'an stood still and asked, "Will you feel any regret if you die here tonight?" "I'll be kicking myself with regret," Li Baozhen replied with a nod. "Regretting the fact that you weren't careful enough?" Qian Ping'an asked with a chuckle. As if resigned to his fate, Li Baozhen replied in an honest manner, "Of course. When I left the Dragon Spring Prefecture's Fortune Street in the Great Li Empire, I felt like the world was a vast place for me to unleash my potential. However, I was far too unwise. Qian Ping'an, with the incident from before and our encounter now, you've twice taught me a valuable lesson regarding how to conduct myself and how to properly handle matters. The same mistake shouldn't be made 3 times, so let's go our separate ways from now on. What do you say?" Zhu Lian raised his hands and rubbed them together in eagerness, saying with a faint smile, "Even though that old geezer driving the carriage is a far-roaming tier martial artist, this old servant is entirely capable of handling him alone. Young master, both he and I are at the same cultivation level, so please don't blame me if I accidentally go too far, and don't stop myself in time in a while." There was a fervent expression in the old carriage driver's eyes as he stared intently at the hunchbacked old man. The cultivation world in the Azure Phoenix Nation, the Fortune Mountain Nation, the Lofty Sky Nation, and the smaller surrounding nations was shallow, and he was also held back by his responsibilities and unable to freely travel around by himself. As a result, he was completely wasting his skills as a pure martial artist at the 8th tier. He was finally presented with a rare opportunity to show his wares tonight, so how could he possibly let this opportunity slip? However, there was still the scheming Li Baozhen behind him as well as Mr. Lu, who was sitting inside the carriage. His hands were inevitably tied, so he asked, "Just dealing with this subordinate alone will already be quite challenging. Master Li, do you have any brilliant plans that you can share with me? Are you able to keep yourself alive, while also allowing me to fight to my heart's content?" Li Baozhen smiled bitterly and replied, "How could I have envisioned this happening? My brilliant plans are only used for harming other people, and not to save myself." The carriage driver stood up and sneered, "So you're at a complete loss? After scheming and plotting for all this time and weaving a dizzying web for everyone, this is the pathetic result that you achieved?" Li Baozhen smiled and replied, "Then if I could please ask you to put in some extra effort tonight. That way, I'll have an opportunity to mend the situation before it's too late." As a powerful martial artist in the Eastern Treasured Vile continent, it was only natural that the old carriage driver carried heavy responsibilities on his shoulders. Thus, he wouldn't abandon Li Baozhen and kick him while he was down simply because he detested the young man. The carriage shuddered slightly, and Li Baozhen only felt a gentle breeze brush past him as the old carriage driver shot forward and lunged at Qian Ping'an. The thicket of reeds beside the road immediately leaned toward Qian Ping'an and Zhu Lian. With his back hunched over as always, Zhu Lian took several steps forward and extended an arm, with his movements as quick as lightning. Zhu Lian caught the furious punch of the old carriage driver that was surging with fist aura and causing his sleeves to billow. He then slid back and came to a perfect stop right beside Qian Ping'an. Meanwhile, the old carriage driver also borrowed his backward momentum to gracefully leap back and land on the ground. The shockwave of their collision caused the thicket of reeds to fall to both sides with a whoosh. The reeds rustled against each other, and this was a particularly loud and piercing sound in the deathly silent night. Li Baozhen saw the dissipating fist aura drift toward the unmoving Qian Ping'an, yet the fist aura was like a light drizzle pitter-pattering against an oil paper umbrella, completely unable to land on the person standing underneath. Li Baozhen's eyelids quivered when he saw this, as expected of someone who was at least at the 5th tier of martial arts. By the looks of it, this little bastard from Clay Vase Alley had obtained quite a few fated opportunities after leaving the Jewel's small world. Upon thinking of this, Li Baozhen felt a slight sense of regret. Perhaps he should have chosen the path of cultivation in the beginning? Qian Ping'an was yet to reach 18, but he had already advanced to the peak stage of the 5th tier. Even in the Great Li Empire, where there was no shortage of talented martial artists, he could still be regarded as an outstanding prodigy, right? Perhaps this bastard bumpkin had obtained the vast amount of martial fortune resulting from the collapse of the Jewel's small world all by himself? But this didn't make sense. There was Song Chongjing, Li Er, and also Zheng Dafeng, so after the three of them split up the martial fortune, there should have only been some tiny scraps left behind for him. Julien shook his wrist and chuckled. Senior brother, your punch feels a little weak. What's wrong? Are you being polite with me? Are you afraid of being bored if you kill me with a single punch? Oh, please don't worry, and please don't hold back either. Punch me to your heart's content, and punch me as hard as you can. My skin is very thick, meaning that I'm able to cop a good beating. Senior brother, if you insist on holding back, then I'll have to step up to show you how it's done. Right after Julien finished speaking, he dashed forward like a wild ape, with his speed insanely quick as if he were using an immortal land-shortening talisman. He arrived in front of the old carriage driver in a flash and returned the favor from before, also throwing a straight punch. Li Baozhen's eyesight was very ordinary, so he only managed to see Julien's first punch. Afterward, the battle between Julien and the old carriage became a dizzying blur as the two martial artists exchanged blows in a small area. It wasn't long before Li Baozhen's ears started to feel extremely uncomfortable, and only after gulping did he feel slightly better. The old carriage driver gave a soft shout and half-punched, half-shoved Julien toward the thicket of reeds. Meanwhile, he took a single step back and forcefully stomped on the ground. At the same time, he lightly raised his other foot and stabilized his body. If it weren't for the fact that the old carriage driver needed to protect Li Baozhen behind him, then he could have naturally thrown his punches in a more forceful and carefree manner. Julien stretched his body in midair and landed on a thin reed with a single foot. After swaying left and right for a brief moment, he smiled faintly and said, Senior brother, you've already been stuck at the 8th tier for so many years. Your path of cultivation seems quite bumpy. You're crawling instead of walking along the path to the summit of cultivation. Am I right? You're speaking a bit too soon, no? The old carriage driver sneered. Julien lightly and nimbly walked across the tips of the reeds, also continuing to relax his bones and tendons as he did so. There was a series of popping sounds as he chuckled and said, No, it's not too soon at all. I'm afraid that we two brothers will truly fight to the death, resulting in you being unable to leave a dying message in a moment. I've heard that 8th tier martial artists are quite rare in this world, so I'll inevitably feel a sense of sadness if a fellow martial artist at the 8th tier suddenly dies here tonight. Thus, I'm seizing this opportunity to chat with you before my young master starts to complain about you being an eyesore. The old carriage driver remained silent. Inside the carriage, Lu Qingfeng was just about to stand up. However, a streak of brilliant white light suddenly exploded from Chan Ping'an's sword-nurturing gourd and rapidly arced through the air, slicing through the carriage wall without any trouble, and coming to a stop right in front of Lu Qingfeng's glabella. Lu Qingfeng smiled and sat back down. One of Li Baozhen's hands was hidden inside his sleeve, and he was just about to make a move when a wisp of green sword light flashed through the air and pierced through his sleeve, nailing his talisman to the carriage wall behind him. The golden talisman was extremely strange, and there were surprisingly characters drawn on both sides of the talisman paper. Not only that, but there was even a black-armored divine warrior and a white-armored divine warrior respectively drawn in the center of the front and back of the talisman. This was a day and night wandering deity true body talisman, a talisman that was already long lost in the majestic world. Li Baozhen sighed and said to the carriage driver, You can stop now, there's no need to fight anymore. I, Li Baozhen, will accept my fate of death. Don't stop, Julien exclaimed in a panicked voice. Senior brother, we can enjoy our fight here, and this won't prevent my young master from discussing the proper matters with your master. The old carriage driver nodded and dashed toward Julien. However, Chan Ping'an looked at the carriage curtains and said, I initially thought that the saying, ghosts and deities pry on prominent and wealthy clans, from the books was a good description. I was mistaken as it turns out, and another description seems much more fitting. Fortune and calamity aren't predetermined and are instead summoned by one's actions? Lu Qingfeng asked from inside the carriage. Chan Ping'an didn't say anything else. After all, scholars were well aware of these principles no matter how big or small the principle. This was especially the case for scholars like Lu Qingfeng, who had started reading from a very young age, and had also worked in the government as an official. In reality, it was much easier for observers to read and predict ambitious individuals from the cultivation world such as Zhu Fengxian. They mostly cared about life and death and fame and glory, and they were typically very straightforward and frank in their interactions. Li Baozhen looked at Qian Pingyan. He was sitting in the carriage while Qian Pingyan was standing beside the carriage, allowing their eyes to coincidentally draw level. Regardless of how you found me, how are you going to return to the Great Li Empire after killing me tonight? Li Baozhen asked in curiosity. Are you planning to abandon your ancestral home in the Dragon Spring Prefecture's Clay Vase Alley? Qian Pingyan looked at Li Baozhen, the young man from Fortune Street whom he had never seen before, yet was hellbent on trying to kill him. He was also from the Li clan, so how was he so incredibly different from Li Shixing and little Baoping? Seeing Qian Pingyan remain silent, Li Baozhen smiled and continued. I'm nothing more than a scholar who can't withstand a single punch from you. This is truly a case of changing fortunes. Just a few years have passed, yet our fortunes have already changed this much. Things have changed far too quickly, in fact. If I had known earlier that you would change so much, then I would have persuaded you to join my side as well. That way, I wouldn't be facing the prospect of dying in a foreign land in addition to uprooting and leaving my home right now. This was all it took to knock the wind out of Li Baozhen, causing him to curl over and clutch his stomach in pain. He gasped for breath and almost vomited his intestines out. In fact, Qian Pingyan had only used the strength of a second-tier martial artist to attack Li Baozhen. Qian Pingyan grabbed Li Baozhen by the hair and dragged him down from the carriage, casually tossing him aside and causing him to roll down the yellow dirt road. In the end, Li Baozhen came to a stop with his arms and legs sprawled apart and tears streaming down his face. He wasn't crying because of grief or regret, and this was instead a natural response to the immense physical pain that he was suffering at this moment. Li Baozhen roared with laughter and exclaimed, Who would have thought that I, Li Baozhen, would also suffer such a fate one day? Lu Qingfeng, remember to collect my corpse and bring it back to the Great Li Empire's Dragon Spring Prefecture. Qian Pingyan squatted down. Li Baozhen stared him in the eye. What he saw was a familiar yet unfamiliar pair of eyes. Qian Pingyan's eyes weren't a bottomless abyss like Imperial Preceptor Cui Chan's eyes that Li Baozhen was glad that he couldn't see the bottom of. Otherwise, it was very likely that he would have become a corpse a long time ago. After all, being able to see the fish in a deep pond was an inauspicious sign. One he was far from having the right to pry into the secrets and thoughts hidden deep inside embroidered tiger Cui Chan's mind. However, there was one similarity between Qian Pingyan and Imperial Preceptor Cui Chan's eyes, and this was a similarity that was etched deep into Li Baozhen's mind. One among a bottomless abyss and one at the bottom of an ancient well. Li Baozhen could faintly sense a sinister fled dragon swimming around and yearning to raise its head. A sense of delight suddenly filled Li Baozhen's eyes, and he said in a soft voice, Qian Pingyan, I'm waiting for you to become someone like me. I eagerly await the arrival of that day. Qian Pingyan grabbed a handful of soil from the ground before lightly striking Li Baozhen's throat with the side of his palm. When Li Baozhen involuntarily opened his mouth in pain, Qian Pingyan stuffed the soil into his mouth and used his hand to hold it firmly inside, asking, Does it taste good? Li Baozhen thrashed around, with his face also becoming beet red. Qian Pingyan cocked his head to the side and asked, What did you say? I can't hear you. Care to speak a little louder? Li Baozhen suddenly stopped struggling and forcefully swallowed the large handful of soil. His gaze was firmly fixed on the apathetic face of the young man. Qian Pingyan released his hand, and Li Baozhen's expression was twisted as he replied in a muffled voice. It tasted fairly good. Qian Pingyan nodded and said, It's not easy to feed you shit right now, but feeding you some soil isn't a difficult ask. Just like before, Li Baozhen was forced to open his mouth and accept another large handful of soil. His mouth was held shut by Qian Pingyan, who was using even more force this time, causing Li Baozhen's head to sink slightly into the road. Li Baozhen's chest heaved after Qian Pingyan loosened his grip, and he found it extremely difficult to breathe after swallowing 2 mouthfuls of soil. He then broke into a violent fit of coughing, ejecting many specks of soil from his mouth. Qian Pingyan raised his right hand and gently flicked his sleeve, swatting away the specks of soil that were flying toward him. At the same time, Li Baozhen howled in agony. Qian Pingyan's left hand was tightly wrapped around Li Baozhen's left wrist, causing it to creak and forcing him to unclench the fist that he had secretly made. Li Baozhen's hands spread apart, revealing the jade pendant that he had secretly grabbed from his waist. The character's dragon palace were inscribed on the beautiful piece of jade passed down by his ancestors, and this jade pendant hadn't been especially eye-catching to begin with. Now, however, it was sparkling and crystal clear with a thin wisp of light rapidly circling around inside it. Li Baozhen's wrist was shattered by Qian Pingyan, causing his left arm to fall limply to the ground. He had only been a second away from activating the mystical ability contained inside the jade pendant. Qian Pingyan grabbed the jade pendant and said, "Thanks." His flying swords, 1st and 15th, also returned from Lu Qingfeng's glabella and the carriage wall at this moment, with one of them bringing back the talisman that few people in the world could recognize. However, Qian Pingyan immediately recognized the precious talisman and put it away into his pocket treasure along with the Dragon Palace jade pendant. The Day and Night Wandering Deity True Body Talisman was an extremely high-grade talisman in the authentic death-avoiding book, reflected by the fact that it was recorded on the third last page of the book. Li Baozhen held his left wrist with his right hand and said with a pitiful smile, "You win this time. I'm truly afraid of you now." The Dragon Palace jade pendant was a life-saving treasure passed down by the ancestors of the Li clan, while the Day and Night Wandering Deity True Body Talisman was a farewell gift from his older brother, Li Shisheng. Most importantly, both of these extraordinarily valuable immortal treasures couldn't be detected by others unless Li Baozhen personally unlocked them first. Not only that, but they would also be worthless in the hands of anyone below the upper 5 tiers, even if the person in question were an earth immortal. Qian Pingyan launched a kick at Li Baozhen's waist, sending him flying through the thicket of reeds and plummeting into the river. Such severe wounds would take 100 days to heal. Lu Qingfeng stood up and walked out of the carriage, jumping to the ground and saying, "Regardless of what your reason is, young Master Qian, thank you for sparing Li Baozhen. What's going to happen to the Lion Garden? What's going to happen to Lu Qingshan?" Qian Pingyan asked. "I've already planned a path of retreat for them," Lu Qingfeng replied. Qian Pingyan looked slightly exhausted, and he initially hadn't wanted to say much to the eldest son of Assistant Minister Lu. Upon thinking of the limping young scholar, however, he asked, "I trust that the outcome you're seeking is most likely positive. You, Lu Qingfeng, should also be well aware that you've embarked on a different path now. However, how can you guarantee that you'll stay on this path and not stray further and further away from your intended outcome?" Lu Qingfeng smiled wryly and gazed into the distance, sighing with emotion and replying, "I can only give it my best shot. Otherwise, everyone in the Azure Phoenix Nation, from the Emperor to the officials and scholars, and then to the commoners, will have their backs shattered by someone very soon. At that time, we'll no longer have a path to walk on. Everyone knows that drinking poison to quench thirst is a stupid thing to do, but if the alternative is dying from thirst, then who wouldn't take the risk? This is similar to the scenario that played out in the ancestral hall of the Lion Garden, where Lady Lu Shu, whom I detest greatly, demanded my father to drag you into the mess. If I were present, then I wouldn't have been able to step forward and firmly maintain the values and dignity of the Lu clan like my brother, Lu Qingshan. After weighing up the benefits, I would have chosen to go against my conscience." Lu Qingfeng retracted his gaze and continued with a smile, "Thankfully, the worst-case scenario didn't eventuate. We all have our burdens to bear, and every family has its hardships to overcome. As their older brother, let me face these hardships. My younger brother can focus on studying the scholarly books." Qian Pingyan glanced at the location where Li Baozhen had fallen into the pond and remarked, "You're much better than that person at least." He then looked toward the battle taking place above the thicket of reeds in the distance and shouted, "You can come back here now." After shouting this, he turned to Lu Qingfeng and said, "And you guys can rescue him now. Why didn't you directly kill Li Baozhen?" Lu Qingfeng asked. Qian Pingyan shook his head and replied, "I promised someone that I would spare Li Baozhen once." Zhu Lian dashed back to Qian Pingyan's side with a disappointed expression, reaching up to wipe the bloodstains from his face. He had only just warmed up, and it would have been time for that old carriage driver to suffer a beating and beg for a swift death in a moment. Seeing that Qian Pingyan was seemingly unwilling to explain anything, Zhu Lian didn't crack any jokes and instead walked behind his young master in silence. Lu Qingfeng suddenly turned around to face Qian Pingyan's back, saying, "Young Master Qian, it's best that you don't stay near the capital to wait for another opportunity, hoping to both honor your promise and to encounter Li Baozhen again. Chen Ping'an turned around and asked with a smile. And why is that? Lu Qingfeng smiled and shook his head, not revealing any more information. The Great Li Empire was about to dispatch 2 people to act as guards for him and Li Baozhen respectively. Moreover, it was said that one of these people had once been a powerful general of the destroyed Lu Empire. However, this wasn't the most important reason for Lu Qingfeng's warning. Instead, the most critical reason was that the Great Li Empire's imperial preceptor Cui Chan was most likely still in the Azure Phoenix Nation. Chen Ping'an and his companions slowly disappeared into the distance. The old carriage driver fished the dying Li Baozhen from the lake and gently compressed his chest, helping him to hurriedly spit up a mouthful of water. It took a long time for Li Baozhen to recover. After surviving a very close brush with death, Li Baozhen sat on the road with a dazed expression. The old carriage driver stood beside Li Baozhen and turned his head around to look at Lu Qingfeng. Lu Qingfeng smiled and shook his head. And thus Li Baozhen once again survived a very close brush with death. Li Baozhen was sitting with his back facing the 2 people who had just exchanged a glance, and the young master who had become as disheveled as could be tonight suddenly slapped himself with all his might. He then turned around and said with a smile, "By the looks of it, Mr. Lu still cares a lot about the imperial preceptor's opinion." Lu Qingfeng squatted down and said with a faint smile, "If it were another person who had come to the Azure Phoenix Nation, they wouldn't have necessarily done any better than you." Li Baozhen pretended to burp, saying, "I'm completely stuffed after eating all that soil and drinking all that water." Sure enough, the water in the cultivation world is deep enough to easily drown someone. I almost became a corpse at the bottom of the lake. Lu Qingfeng helped Li Baozhen up and said, "By the looks of it, we need to return to the lion garden and give you a fresh change of clothes first." Li Baozhen cocked his head to the side and skipped around for a while, shaking the water out from his ears. With a brilliant smile on his face, he then replied, "It's okay, there's no need to get changed at all. This will serve as a stark reminder for me to be careful in the future, lest I still hold on to the belief that the heavens are the strongest, the imperial preceptor is second, and I'm third." Lu Qingfeng didn't say anything. Li Baozhen started to shiver after entering the carriage and sitting down. The horse-drawn carriage slowly trundled forward, not encountering Chen Ping'an again as it left the road with reeds and entered the official road. Lu Qingfeng's voice was calm as he said, "Firstly, I encourage you to return to the lion garden. Otherwise, I'll still need to attend to your sickbed after we return to the county office. Secondly, let these words serve as a warning to both you and me. Words used to hurt others are even sharper than blades, and techniques used to harm others are even more ferocious than beasts." Li Baozhen's lips were white as he stared at Lu Qingfeng, and his teeth involuntarily chattered as he asked, "Lu Qingfeng, do you know what I lost in this encounter with Chen Ping'an? Do I need you to utter these lofty words? Is what you lost as important as your life?" Lu Qingfeng asked. Li Baozhen cracked a grin and replied, "Of course not." He then turned around and shouted to the old carriage driver, "Turn around and return to the lion garden." Lu Qingfeng closed his eyes and rested his mind. Only at this moment did Li Baozhen finally regard Lu Qingfeng as an ally, and someone whom he should regard as an equal. Or perhaps Li Baozhen was conceding that he was indeed inferior to Lu Qingfeng at this current moment. His name was Cool Breeze, yet his heart was like extinguished ashes. However, these extinguished ashes were showing signs of flickering back to life. Those fully focused on their tasks would hear not the cracking thunder and lightning. Unexpectedly, the small Azure Phoenix Nation had given birth to such a person. Ro was feeling the most relaxed right now. They had mysteriously left the capital at night, with Chen Ping'an saying that he needed to pay a visit to a fellow townsman. Pei Qian hadn't thought much about this, but Ro had detected an unfamiliar aura hidden inside Chen Ping'an's body. Killing intent. Sure enough, Julien had engaged in an intense fight with someone. Thankfully, Chen Ping'an and Julien had both said that everything was fine after returning. Ro didn't ask any additional questions. Chen Ping'an was a trustworthy person, so if he personally said that everything was fine, then everything was fine. As for Julien, however, Ro wouldn't trust him even if he patted his chest until it was broken and guaranteed that everything was fine. Even though Pei Qian didn't understand the situation, she was still utterly terrified by the faint smell of blood lingering on Julien's body. "Master, were they enemies from your hometown?" Pei Qian asked in a soft voice. Qian Ping'an thought for a moment before exhaling the murky breath that had been stuck in his chest for a long time. He grabbed his sword-nurturing gourd and drank a sip of the wine that he had bought in the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation. He then smiled faintly and replied, "There's no need to worry about these things, the problem has been resolved for the time being." Zhu Lian was aware that Qian Ping'an had obtained a talisman and a jade pendant. Even though he hadn't examined them carefully, there was one thing that Zhu Lian was certain of. It was very likely the case that not a single person who had left Qian Ping'an's small town and chose to wander around the outside world was an ordinary person. For example, there was Old Dragon City's Zheng Dafeng as well as Li Er who had hurriedly shown himself and then left. The former was at the 9th tier while the latter was at the 10th tier. With this in mind, the two items that Qian Ping'an had snatched from that person's hands were definitely extremely valuable treasures. However, Qian Ping'an replied, "I didn't benefit and I didn't suffer a loss either. I obtained two items, and I plan to give them to someone who can make better use of them than me." "Oh, okay," Pei Qian said. "Everything would be fine as long as there were no problems." She turned around and glanced at the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation in the distance. She held her hiking pole in one hand and her small gourd in her other hand. Zhu Lian turned his head, following which Shi Ro also shifted her gaze. Zhu Lian smiled and asked, "Are you worried about me, Lady Shi Ro?" Shi Ro remained silent. Zhu Lian clicked his tongue in wonder and said, "Lady Shi Ro, you might not know, but the person who I fought against was a far-roaming tier superior grandmaster. His cultivation was paramount, and his strength was immense. He could shatter the mountains and split the earth with a single punch, and he could also flip the mountains and rotate the seas with a single punch. And even then he still couldn't kill you, Zhu Lian? That being the case, aren't your fist techniques unfathomable, and your strength unmatched in the world?" Shi Ro asked with a sneer. Zhu Lian chuckled and replied, "And that's where you're mistaken. That senior brother was far too polite, and he was unwilling to fight me to the death from the beginning to the end. Otherwise, I wouldn't be standing next to you right now without any severe injuries. Instead, Lady Shi Ro would have had to see me in a pitiful state, with my flesh broken and the bones on my arms showing. At that time, Lady Shi Ro would shed tears of grief, while I would also feel utter sorrow. I would definitely flare up in anger for the sake of my love, and I would rush back to the battlefield to collect the scattered pieces of that senior brother's corpse. That way, I could stitch him back together and whip his corpse again." Shi Ro treated his words as nothing more than wind passing by her ears. "While we're on our way to the Dragon Spring Prefecture after we visit the Great Sui Nation's Mountain Cliff Academy, we might need to look for a female ghost in a wedding dress who lives in a residence hidden in the mountain forests," Qian Ping'an suddenly said. "Her cultivation base isn't weak, but we won't necessarily be able to find her." Zhu Lian was delighted and he asked, "Young master, is that female ghost in the wedding dress pretty? How does she compare to Lady Shi Ro's original appearance?" Qian Ping'an smiled and replied, "When I saw her for the first time back then, her face was deathly pale and she was wearing a bright red wedding dress. I simply found her creepy, and I didn't pay too much attention to her actual appearance." Pei Qian secretly gulped and stuck a talisman on her forehead. "What percentage of your strength do you need to defeat that 8th-tier martial artist?" Qian Ping'an asked in a quiet voice. Zhu Lian appeared slightly bashful as he replied, "Young master, I always unleash my full strength when I fight with others. Thus, if young master told me to stop a moment later, then I might have truly ripped that senior brother into 8 pieces. Moreover, it's anyone's guess whether he could have become a water ghost or not." "That's a good habit," Qian Ping'an remarked in helplessness. Zhu Lian smiled sheepishly in response. "Old cook, why aren't you trying to flatter my master now? Why don't you say that you learned this from him?" Pei Qian asked in a gloating voice. Zhu Lian chuckled and kicked Pei Qian in the backside, sending her sprawling forward. However, Pei Qian instinctively stuck her hiking pole in the ground, allowing her to rapidly spin in a circle. However, she wasn't in a hurry to curse Zhu Lian, nor was she curious about why she hadn't fallen over. Instead, Pei Qian pulled out from the ground the hiking that had accompanied her for a long time and ran over to Qian Ping'an, asking in a puzzled voice, "Master, I've had this old mountain god for so long, so how has it still not snapped yet? See, there's not even a single crack in it, right? Perhaps I picked up a treasure right from the very beginning?" Is this truly a branch from some immortal tree planted by a mountain god? Chen Ping'an smiled and offered no response. Zhu Lian roared with laughter and revealed, "Young master used an immortal technique to refine this hiking pole for you a long time ago. Otherwise it would have snapped into pieces very early on. After all, how can ordinary branches withstand the abuse of your deranged demon sword technique?" Pei Qian scratched her head and said, "Oh, is that so?" It was as if she found this surprising yet expected. Afterward, the little girl with a wild imagination looked up at the night sky and asked, "Why isn't it raining yet?" Chen Ping'an was practicing the six-step walking meditation right now, and he asked, "Why should it rain?" Pei Qian was also practicing the white ape sword carrying technique now, temporarily using her hiking pole as a sword. As she practiced this, she replied, "If it rains, then I can hold an umbrella for master." Zhu Lian raised his foot to kick her backside again. Yet Pei Qian nimbly dodged his attack, causing the hunchbacked old man to chuckle and scold, "You're a shorty who doesn't grow taller regardless of how much you eat. So how are you going to hold up an umbrella for your master?" Pei Qian was extremely vexed, and she hung her head in disappointment and conceded, "That's true. It's fine as long as your heart is in the right place," Chen Ping'an consoled. "This money-losing child has nothing left but some heart," Zhu Lian chuckled. Pei Qian glared at Zhu Lian and said, "If it weren't for your injuries, I would have definitely forced you to take a lesson from my self-created deranged demon sword technique. Come on, let's spar with each other." Zhu Lian strode forward, and Pei Qian roared with laughter as she started to run in circles around Chen Ping'an. Shiro felt slightly adrift as she looked at this. Even though Pei Qian had followed Chen Ping'an into the mountains and through the rivers, she was still a tan little girl just like always. However, as she ran around under the moonlight and on the smooth official road at this moment, it was as if there were a faint sheen of bright light enveloping her body. The question was, would things be the same or completely different when Pei Qian one day traveled through the cultivation world by herself? For example, would she be like the radiant sun, one that blinded onlookers from very far away? As they continued to walk, Shiro started to regret the fact that she had developed such complicated and meaningless thoughts. However, she couldn't help this, as Pei Qian was indeed far too unruly and mischievous. It was already summer, and they were going to arrive at the immortal ferry station located in the eastern region of the Azure Phoenix Nation very soon. On this day, Pei Qian ran to some distant place in the old mountain forest to collect dry branches for starting a fire to cook food. Her body was covered in dirt and her hair was filled with grass when she returned, and there was a gray hair in her hands which she was holding by the ears. She sprinted over to Chen Ping'an and swung the pitiful hair around, exclaiming in delight, "Master, look at what I caught! It's a wild hare that hops extremely fast." Chen Ping'an smiled and replied, "We're going to eat vegetarian food instead of meat today, so how about you release this hare?" Pei Qian was astonished, and she immediately felt a slight sense of reluctance afterward. After all, it had taken her a lot of effort to catch this hare. "Master, can we keep it and raise it until it's fat before we kill it and eat it?" she asked. "I can tie it up with a long rope and look after it in the meantime." Chen Ping'an waved his hand and replied, "If you truly want to eat meat, then we can ask Zhu Lian to catch a wild boar for you later." Pei Qian thought about this for a moment and decided that it was a beneficial trade for her. That being the case, it wouldn't hurt to release this hare. She nodded in agreement before taking a deep breath and spinning around in a circle, tossing away the wild hare in her hands with all her might. With a whoosh, the wild hare that was potentially fortunate and potentially pitiful quickly vanished into the distance. "Fly, my little bro." Shiro facebombed when she saw this. Pei Qian patted her hands and squatted in front of the stove beside Chen Ping'an, asking in curiosity, "Master, what day is it today? Is there any deeper meaning? For example, is it the birthday of some powerful mountain god? Is that why we can't eat meat in the mountains today?" Chen Ping'an simply smiled and replied, "There's no deeper meaning. The immortal ferry station on the border of the Azure Phoenix Nation was the most ordinary ferry station that Chen Ping'an had seen. Not only was it lacking the restrictive formations of most immortal ferry stations, but it was as if this ferry station were afraid that wealthy mortals weren't willing to visit it. Chen Ping'an and the others were still dozens of kilometers away from the ferry station when they started to see people advertising the immortal ferry station and trying to win business. As it turned out, this immortal ferry station carried all kinds of strange routes. For example, one could travel to some immortal abode near the Azure Phoenix Nation, and one could sit at the fishing platform atop some mountain and cast one's fishing line into the sea of clouds to fish for some kind of precious bird or flying fish. Because of this, the road to the immortal ferry station was bustling with people. It was also here that Qian Pingyan heard many pieces of news about the capital. For example, Emperor Tang Li had listened to the voices of his people and established Confucianism as the fundamental teaching of the nation. As for Buddhism and Taoism, it was said that they needed to wait for a while longer before it was determined which would be second and which would be third. A small Taoist temple called the White Cloud Temple suddenly became a royal Taoist temple that the imperial family of the Azure Phoenix Nation visited to offer incense and pray to deities. At the same time, a young and previously unknown monk from the White Water Temple started to expound Buddhist teachings to the mortal world, spreading these teachings in the Buddhist temple, on the roads, and even in the bustling marketplaces. It was said that his teachings were extremely plain and simple, so much so that even little children could understand him. Meanwhile, Qian Pingyan and the others boarded a normal-sized immortal ship without a hitch. Pei Qian looked a little listless and downcast, and she quietly returned to her room after transcribing some texts in Qian Pingyan's room. She was like a completely different person from normal. Qian Pingyan went to ask Julien about this, but Julien couldn't offer any explanation either. In the end, he had no option but to ask Shiro, and the latter offered her view on the situation. The next day, Pei Qian was just about to leave after transcribing the texts. However, Qian Pingyan called her over and left the room with her, going to the bow of the immortal ship to enjoy the scenery of the Sea of Clouds together. The young man and the little girl stood in front of the railing, and Qian Pingyan grabbed his sword nurturing gourd and was just about to drink some wine. Pei Qian also grabbed her small gourd and raised it above her head, glancing left and right as she did so. Qian Pingyan chose not to drink, and he retied the wine gourd to his waist before turning around and asking with a smile, "There's something on your mind?" Pei Qian exerted herself and stood on her tippy toes so that she could lean over the railings. She then replied in a quiet voice, "Master, after we arrive at Mountain Cliff Academy, will you not like me and only like little Baoping who refers to you as junior uncle?" Qian Pingyan gazed into the distance, shaking his head and replying, "Of course not." Pei Qian sat down and crossed her arms, saying, "I don't believe you." Qian Pingyan sat down beside her and raised his foot, winking at Pei Qian as he did so. Pei Qian immediately smiled upon seeing the pair of boots on Qian Pingyan's feet, and she swirled her small gourd around and said, "Let's drink some wine, master." Qian Pingyan laughed heartily and grabbed his sword nurturing gourd again, clinking it together with Pei Qian's small gourd before taking a swig of wine. Pei Qian pretended that her small gourd was also filled with wine as she tilted her head back and pretended to drink. She then stood up and retreated several steps, stumbling around like an inebriated little drunkard as she exclaimed, "Oh ho ho, it seems like I've had a bit too much to drink, master." Qian Pingyan couldn't help but chuckle when he saw this. He was just about to call out and warn her, but Pei Qian had already stumbled into a burly man walking behind her. There was a long saber hanging by the man's waist and he sneered and spat, "Piss off, you blind little brat." The man grabbed Pei Qian's head, twisting his wrist and preparing to throw her aside. Before he could exert any force, however, his wrist was grabbed by a young man carrying a sword on his back. Pei Qian hurriedly apologized to the burly man, saying, "Sorry, I didn't see you walking behind me just then. Sorry for walking into you." The man furrowed his brows, most probably feeling like he was losing face by being stopped by the young man. He refused to give in, and he immediately exerted more strength and attempted to use his astral energy to push the impudent weakling away. He would then toss this tan little troublemaker aside. However, agonizing pain instantly shot through the wrist of the burly man at this moment, causing him to surprisingly fall to his knees, with sweat pouring down his face. Qian Pingyan smiled faintly at Pei Qian and gestured for her to stand behind him. He then held his gourd-holding hand behind his back and released his grip from the pure martial artist's wrist, placing his hand on the burly man's head instead. He bent down and asked expressionlessly, "Are you seeking death?" His fingers were like powerful claws. The burly man became as pale as a sheet, yet he gritted his teeth and refused to beg for forgiveness. After a while he was genuinely unable to withstand the pain any longer, so he shouted in a furious voice, "That's it, you've crossed the line now, I'll definitely get you back for this." He was traveling on this immortal ship with 7 or 8 companions, and these people immediately rushed over and were just about to use their advantage in numbers to entertain themselves. Indeed, this was a good opportunity for them to beat the young man and the little girl into cripples to alleviate their boredom. However, 2 flying swords immediately materialized in front of the glabella of the man rushing at the forefront. Seeing this, the group of 7 or 8 people felt like they had plummeted into an icy cave. It was a blazing summer's day, yet their bodies were gripped by an ice-cold chill. In this world, sword cultivators were the most direct when it came to killing people. Moreover, these people most likely didn't know that this wasn't so much about whether Chen Ping'an was a sword cultivator or not. After all, Chen Ping'an had crossed the lines of quite a few foes. Not only that, but the cultivation bases and backgrounds of his foes were also quite powerful. Thus, Chen Ping'an was least afraid of making new enemies. Chen Ping'an lifted the kneeling man by the head and kicked him in the chest, sending him flying backward into his companions. They all jumped in fear, and the group of companions in distress quickly fled for their lives together. Chen Ping'an turned around and smiled at Pei Qian, saying, "Don't be scared. If anyone bullies you in the cultivation world in the future, then come home and look for your master."